Welcome, guardian of Gotham's secrets, to a journey through the shadowed inconsistencies that dwell within the Dark Knight's chronicles. Tonight, we shall explore the curious contradictions and narrative puzzles that have woven themselves into Batman's legend. Across decades of storytelling, let the rhythm of logical inconsistencies and the whisper of cape against continuity carry you into peaceful slumber as we examine every thread of confusion that has tested even the most dedicated fans. Close your eyes, protector of narrative truth, and let these tales of temporal paradox and character contradiction unfold like pages from a detective's case file, written in moonlight and mystery. In the labyrinthine chronicles of Gotham's Dark Knight, there exists perhaps no greater puzzle than the fundamental impossibility of Bruce Wayne's existence within any coherent temporal framework, a paradox so profound that it challenges the very foundations upon which his legend has been constructed across nearly a century of storytelling. This is the eternal conundrum of a man who has somehow managed to compress lifetimes of training, experience, and heroic activity into a biographical timeline that defies not merely the constraints of human longevity, but the basic mathematics of existence itself. The most immediately apparent manifestation of this temporal impossibility lies in Bruce Wayne's perpetual youth, his remarkable ability to maintain the physical and mental acuity of a man in his prime, despite having supposedly been active as Batman for periods that should have rendered him ancient by any reasonable calculation. Across the decades of publication, from his first appearance in 1939 to the present day, Batman has consistently been portrayed as a figure at the height of his capabilities, a warrior whose reflexes remain lightning quick, whose intellect continues to operate at peak efficiency, and whose body shows no signs of the accumulated wear and tear that should inevitably result from decades of nightly combat against Gotham's most dangerous criminals. This ageless quality becomes particularly problematic when one attempts to reconcile the various origin stories and milestone events that have defined Batman's career with any realistic understanding of human development and aging. According to most canonical accounts, Bruce Wayne began his transformation into Batman sometime in his mid to late 20s, having spent the preceding years traveling the world to acquire the vast array of skills that would enable his war on crime. Yet if we accept that he has been active as Batman for the 10 to 15 years that most contemporary storylines suggest, he should now be approaching middle age, showing the first signs of the physical decline that would inevitably accompany such an extended career of physical punishment and psychological stress. The mathematics become even more bewildering when we consider the compressed timeline within which Bruce Wayne supposedly acquired his legendary array of skills and capabilities before ever donning the cape and cowl. According to various accounts, his post-childhood education encompassed mastery of multiple martial arts disciplines from across the globe, advanced training in detective work and forensic science, comprehensive study of psychology and criminal behavior, extensive education in engineering and technology, proficiency in numerous languages, and expertise in fields as diverse as chemistry, medicine, and theatrical performance. The sheer scope of this educational undertaking would require decades of dedicated study under optimal conditions, yet canonical timelines typically allow for no more than 10 to 12 years between his parents' murder and his debut as Batman, even assuming the most accelerated learning possible and the luxury of focusing entirely on skill acquisition, without the distractions of maintaining his Bruce Wayne identity. The timeline remains mathematically impossible when one considers that genuine mastery of even a single martial art typically requires years of dedicated practice, while achieving expertise in multiple disciplines would demand exponentially more time and effort. The problem becomes even more acute when we examine the specific claims made about Bruce Wayne's training during his formative years. Stories have depicted him studying with ninja masters in the mountains of Asia for months or years at a time, apprenticing with world-renowned detectives in European capitals, learning advanced combat techniques from military specialists in remote locations, and mastering theatrical arts from accomplished performers in various cultural centers. Each of these educational experiences would realistically require significant time investment to achieve the level of proficiency that Batman demonstrates. Yet the aggregate time required far exceeds what any reasonable timeline could accommodate. Furthermore, the logistical challenges of arranging and completing such diverse educational experiences would themselves consume considerable time and resources. The travel required to reach various training locations, the process of gaining acceptance by secretive masters and exclusive institutions, the cultural adaptation necessary to function effectively in dramatically different environments, and the recovery time needed between intensive training regimens would all contribute to extending the timeline far beyond what canonical accounts typically allow. The temporal paradox deepens when we consider the revolving door of sidekicks and partners who have served alongside Batman throughout his career, each requiring their own extensive training periods and developmental arcs that should collectively span far more years than any coherent timeline can accommodate. Dick Grayson's tenure as Robin supposedly lasted from his early childhood through his late teenage years, encompassing nearly a decade of growth and development, during which he transformed from an acrobatic child into a capable young hero, ready to assume his own independent identity as Nightwing. Yet this decade-long partnership with the first Robin represents only the beginning of Batman's mentoring responsibilities, as he subsequently took on Jason Todd as his second Robin, trained him to competency, witnessed his tragic death, and then eventually welcomed his resurrection and complicated reintegration into the extended Bat family. Following Jason's apparent demise, Bruce adopted Tim Drake as the third Robin, another partnership that supposedly lasted several years and encompassed Tim's development from eager amateur to skilled detective and combatant. The timeline becomes even more convoluted when we account for Stephanie Brown's brief tenure as Robin, Damian Wayne's training and development as both Robin and son, and the various other protégés and allies who have required Batman's personal attention and instruction over the years. Each of these relationships supposedly involved years of intensive training, emotional bonding, and shared adventures that should have aged both Batman and his various partners in realistic fashion, yet somehow all participants remain trapped in a temporal bubble that prevents natural progression and development. The mathematical impossibility extends beyond Batman's personal relationships to encompass the broader narrative of his career and its supposed impact on Gotham City itself. Stories consistently reference Batman's long history of conflict with various villains, his established relationships with police officials and other civic leaders, and his accumulated reputation among both criminals and law-abiding citizens. These elements suggest a career spanning many years, if not decades. Yet the characters involved show no signs of aging or evolution that would naturally result from such extended interaction. The Joker, for instance, has supposedly engaged in countless battles with Batman across years of conflict, each encounter adding to their shared history and psychological understanding of one another. Yet the Clown Prince of Crime appears essentially unchanged from his earliest appearances, showing no signs of the accumulated physical and mental wear that should result from repeated defeats, incarcerations, and escapes. Similarly, other recurring villains like Two-Face, Penguin, and Riddler seem frozen in time, their criminal careers parallel to Batman's heroic journey, yet somehow exempt from the natural consequences of aging and experience. The problem extends to Batman's civilian identity and the complex web of relationships and responsibilities that Bruce Wayne must maintain to preserve his secret and support his nocturnal activities. The successful management of Wayne Enterprises alone should require enormous amounts of time and attention, involving board meetings, strategic planning sessions, public appearances, and the countless other obligations that come with leading a major multinational corporation. Yet somehow Bruce Wayne manages to fulfill these demanding responsibilities while simultaneously maintaining his intensive training regimen, conducting nightly patrols as Batman, and nurturing his various personal relationships and mentoring obligations. The social calendar of a prominent billionaire playboy would itself be nearly impossible to reconcile with Batman's schedule, requiring attendance at charitable functions, cultural events, business gatherings, and social occasions that serve to reinforce Bruce Wayne's public persona and deflect suspicion from his true activities. The preparation required for these appearances, including the cultivation of appropriate social connections and the maintenance of his carefully constructed public image, would demand significant ongoing investment of time and energy that somehow never seems to interfere with his superhero activities. Perhaps most problematically, the timeline paradox extends to Batman's integration into the broader DC universe and his relationships with other heroes, who should theoretically be aging at the same rate and experiencing similar career progression. Superman, Wonder Woman, and other contemporary heroes have supposedly been active for similar periods, yet their shared history and collective adventures seem to exist in a temporal vacuum where years pass without meaningful consequence or development. The Justice League's formation, evolution, and various roster changes should logically span many years and involve the natural progression of relationships and team dynamics. Yet these developments occur within the same compressed time frame that governs all superhero narratives. Major events and crossover stories pile upon one another with frequency that should span decades, yet somehow all participants remain essentially unchanged by these experiences, ready to embark on new adventures without showing signs of accumulated wear or wisdom. The training and skill maintenance required to remain at peak effectiveness as Batman would itself be a full-time occupation for any normal human being, requiring hours of daily physical conditioning, regular practice with various weapons and technologies, ongoing study of criminal behavior and investigative techniques, and constant updating of knowledge in rapidly evolving fields like forensic science and computer technology. The mere act of staying current with advances in these various disciplines would require significant time investment, yet Batman somehow manages to remain at the cutting edge of multiple fields, while also fulfilling his extensive operational and personal obligations. The psychological sustainability of Batman's lifestyle represents another dimension of the temporal paradox, as the emotional and mental stress associated with his dual identity should logically result in eventual breakdown or burnout, regardless of his physical capabilities. The isolation required to maintain his secret identity, combined with the trauma associated with repeated exposure to violence and tragedy, would typically produce psychological consequences that become more severe over time rather than remaining manageable indefinitely. The compartmentalization necessary to function effectively as both Bruce Wayne and Batman requires extraordinary mental discipline and emotional control that should become more difficult to maintain as years pass and the accumulated stress of dual identity takes its toll. Yet Batman shows no signs of the gradual psychological erosion that would realistically result from prolonged exposure to such demanding circumstances, remaining essentially stable and effective, regardless of how many years have supposedly passed since he began his crusade. The regenerative capabilities that Batman demonstrates in recovering from injuries and returning to peak condition also strain credibility when considered across an extended timeline, as the human body's ability to heal and adapt naturally declines with age and accumulated damage. The punishment that Batman regularly absorbs during his battles with supervillains and enhanced criminals should result in chronic conditions, permanent disabilities, and gradual reduction in physical capability. Yet he consistently returns to full effectiveness, regardless of how severe his injuries or how frequently they occur. The financial resources required to sustain Batman's operations across an extended timeline present their own mathematical impossibilities, as the cost of constantly replacing damaged equipment, maintaining extensive technological infrastructure, and supporting various allies and operations would quickly exhaust even the largest fortune. The lack of any realistic accounting for these expenses or explanation of how Wayne Enterprises continues to generate sufficient revenue to support such massive ongoing expenditures adds another layer to the temporal paradox that surrounds Batman's existence. In contemplating these myriad impossibilities and contradictions, we begin to understand that Batman's temporal paradox is not merely a technical problem with comic book continuity, but rather a fundamental reflection of the mythological nature of heroic narratives. Like the gods and heroes of ancient legends, Batman exists in a realm where normal constraints of time and causality yield to the deeper truths that his story seeks to explore and express. His ageless perfection and impossible achievements serve not as realistic biography, but as symbolic representation of human potential and moral commitment that transcends the limitations of ordinary existence. The very impossibility of Batman's timeline becomes, in this light, evidence of his mythological significance rather than a flaw in his construction. Heroes of legend have always existed outside normal temporal constraints, their stories unfolding in cyclical patterns that repeat essential themes, rather than progressing through realistic development and decline. Batman's eternal present, where he remains forever at the height of his powers, despite years of supposed activity, reflects the timeless nature of the principles and struggles he represents. Yet even as we recognize the mythological dimensions of Batman's temporal paradox, the mathematical impossibilities remain fascinating puzzles that illuminate the complex challenges involved in maintaining long-running heroic narratives across multiple decades of publication. Each attempt to reconcile timeline inconsistencies or explain away impossible achievements reveals new layers of complexity and contradiction, creating an ever-expanding web of paradoxes that defies definitive resolution while enriching our understanding of how modern mythology adapts to contemporary storytelling demands. In the shadowed ledgers and financial statements that underpin the legend of Gotham's Dark Knight, there lurk contradictions so profound and mathematical impossibilities, so staggering that they challenge not merely our understanding of corporate finance, but the very foundations of economic reality itself. The fiscal framework that supposedly supports Batman's crusade against crime represents perhaps the most glaring plot hole in his entire mythology, a web of monetary mysteries that would collapse under the slightest scrutiny from any competent accountant or regulatory authority, yet somehow sustains operations on a scale that would bankrupt most nation-states within a matter of months. At the heart of this financial paradox lies Wayne Enterprises, the multinational conglomerate that serves as both Bruce Wayne's inheritance and Batman's unlimited checking account, a corporate entity whose reported earnings and documented expenditures exist in such fundamental opposition that they suggest either the most sophisticated accounting fraud in history or the operation of economic principles that transcend the normal constraints of supply, demand, and mathematical reality. The sheer scope of Batman's nightly operations requires expenditures that should theoretically consume the gross domestic product of small countries, yet Wayne Enterprises continues to generate sufficient revenue to support these activities, while also maintaining its position as one of the most profitable corporations in the world. Consider the most basic element of Batman's operational infrastructure: the various Batcaves that have served as his headquarters throughout his career, each representing a construction and maintenance project that would challenge the resources of major governments. The primary Batcave beneath Wayne Manor is consistently depicted as a vast underground complex featuring multiple levels, sophisticated environmental controls, advanced computer systems, vehicle storage and maintenance facilities, laboratory spaces, training areas, and living quarters that rival the most expensive luxury accommodations available anywhere in the world. The excavation alone required to create such a facility would involve removing millions of cubic feet of earth and rock, requiring specialized equipment, extensive planning, and coordination with geological surveys to ensure structural integrity and prevent environmental damage. The cost of such an undertaking, even assuming the most efficient possible execution, would easily reach hundreds of millions of dollars before any equipment or systems were installed. Yet this represents merely the beginning of the financial commitment required to maintain Batman's operational capabilities. The technological infrastructure housed within the Batcave includes computer systems that consistently surpass anything available through commercial or military channels, suggesting either access to technology that should theoretically cost billions to develop, or the operation of research and development programs that would require their own massive budget allocations. The Batcomputer, as it is commonly known, demonstrates capabilities that would require quantum processing power, artificial intelligence systems more advanced than anything currently available, and database access that spans global intelligence networks, law enforcement systems, and classified government archives. The development costs for such technology would realistically require decades of research by teams of the world's most brilliant computer scientists and engineers, supported by funding that would dwarf the budgets of major technology corporations. The ongoing maintenance and upgrade requirements would similarly demand constant investment in cutting-edge components, specialized personnel, and security measures that protect such valuable and sensitive systems from espionage or sabotage. Yet somehow Wayne Enterprises manages to support these requirements without any apparent impact on its reported financial performance or corporate operations. The transportation elements of Batman's operation present their own mathematical impossibilities, beginning with the various iterations of the Batmobile that have served as his primary vehicle throughout his career. Each version represents a unique engineering achievement that incorporates advanced materials, experimental propulsion systems, sophisticated defensive measures, and specialized equipment that would cost tens of millions of dollars to develop and manufacture. The custom fabrication required for such vehicles would necessitate dedicated manufacturing facilities, specialized tooling, and teams of expert craftsmen whose services would command premium rates. More problematically, the Batmobile's frequent destruction or damage during Batman's adventures would require constant replacement or extensive repair that should quickly exhaust any reasonable vehicle budget. The exotic materials used in its construction, including armor plating capable of withstanding military-grade weapons, engines powerful enough to achieve impossible acceleration and top speeds, and electronic systems that integrate seamlessly with Batman's other technologies, would be difficult or impossible to source through normal commercial channels, requiring instead the development of custom supply chains and exclusive manufacturing agreements. The aerial components of Batman's fleet, including various versions of the Batwing and other flying vehicles, represent even greater financial challenges due to the complex regulatory and technological requirements associated with advanced aircraft development. The research and development costs for vehicles capable of the performance characteristics consistently demonstrated by Batman's aircraft would rival those of major military programs, while the ongoing maintenance and operational requirements would demand specialized facilities, certified personnel, and compliance with aviation regulations that should make covert operation impossible. The replacement rate for Batman's equipment presents perhaps the most insurmountable challenge to any realistic financial analysis, as his adventures consistently result in the destruction or abandonment of expensive gear that should logically be recovered and reused whenever possible. Batarangs crafted from specialized materials and manufactured to precise specifications are routinely left embedded in walls or lost during combat, representing small but constant financial losses that would accumulate to significant sums over time. Grappling guns, communications equipment, protective gear, and countless other devices are regularly destroyed or damaged beyond repair, requiring constant replacement from what must be extensive inventory stockpiles. The insurance implications of Batman's activities present their own category of financial impossibility, as the property damage and liability exposure associated with his adventures should theoretically make Wayne Enterprises uninsurable through any conventional means. The frequency with which Batman's battles result in damage to buildings, vehicles, infrastructure, and public property would create legal liability that could easily reach billions of dollars, yet Bruce Wayne's personal wealth and corporate assets somehow remain protected from such claims. The lack of any apparent insurance claims or legal settlements related to Batman's activities suggests either the operation of a legal framework that defies understanding or the existence of financial resources so vast that such expenses can be absorbed without documentation or impact on reported earnings. The alternative explanation, that Batman's activities somehow avoid creating legal liability despite their obviously destructive nature, would require legal immunities or governmental protections that should be visible in public records and corporate filings. The human resources requirements for supporting Batman's operation present their own financial challenges that multiply the apparent cost of his activities far beyond the direct expenses of equipment and facilities. The maintenance of the Batcave's complex systems would require teams of specialized technicians, security personnel, and support staff whose salaries, benefits, and security clearances would represent major ongoing expenses. The development and manufacture of Batman's equipment would similarly require dedicated teams of engineers, craftsmen, and researchers whose expertise would command premium compensation. The secrecy requirements associated with Batman's identity would necessitate additional security measures and personnel screening that would significantly increase labor costs, while also limiting the pool of available candidates to those willing to accept extraordinary confidentiality, obligations. The psychological pressure and security risks associated with knowledge of Batman's true identity should theoretically require hazard pay and specialized support services that would further increase the human resources budget required to maintain his operation. The international scope of Batman's activities, particularly his involvement with the Justice League and various global threats, extends the financial requirements far beyond what even Wayne Enterprises' substantial resources could reasonably support. The construction and maintenance of Justice League facilities, including the various headquarters that have served the team throughout its existence, would require contributions from member organizations that should be visible in corporate financial statements and budgetary allocations. The Watchtower, the Justice League satellite headquarters, represents a construction project that would challenge the combined resources of major space agencies and require ongoing operational support that should cost hundreds of millions of dollars annually. The life support systems, power generation, communications equipment, transportation logistics, and defensive capabilities required for such a facility would necessitate cutting-edge technology and specialized expertise available only through the most advanced aerospace and defense contractors. Batman's personal contributions to such projects, whether through Wayne Enterprises or private funding, should create financial documentation that would be impossible to hide from regulatory scrutiny or corporate oversight. The board of directors of Wayne Enterprises should reasonably demand explanations for expenditures that serve no apparent business purpose, while regulatory agencies should investigate unusual financial flows that suggest possible illegal activities or unreported business operations. The tax implications of Batman's activities present another layer of financial impossibility that should attract immediate attention from revenue authorities and forensic accountants. The purchase of specialized equipment, construction materials, technology components, and services required for his operation should generate tax liabilities and documentation requirements that would make secrecy impossible. The deductions and expenses associated with such purchases should create audit triggers that would expose the discrepancies between reported business activities and actual expenditures. The charitable activities associated with the Wayne Foundation and other philanthropic endeavors linked to Bruce Wayne's public persona should similarly create documentation trails that would reveal inconsistencies with his private activities. The tax benefits associated with charitable giving would require detailed record keeping and regulatory compliance that should make it impossible to hide the sources and applications of such substantial financial resources. The global economic impact of Wayne Enterprises' supposed profitability, combined with the known expenditures associated with Batman's activities, suggests revenue generation capabilities that would make the company one of the most valuable entities in human history. The profit margins required to support such extensive operations while maintaining competitive performance in Wayne Enterprises' various business sectors would require market dominance and pricing power that should attract regulatory attention and antitrust scrutiny. The research and development investments apparently made by Wayne Enterprises to support Batman's technological requirements should produce intellectual property and commercial applications that would revolutionize multiple industries and generate profits that dwarf those of major technology corporations. The failure to commercialize such advanced technologies, or even to acknowledge their existence in corporate filings, represents either massive mismanagement of valuable assets or deliberate concealment of breakthrough innovations. The vendor relationships required to source Batman's specialized equipment and materials should create extensive documentation trails and contractual obligations that would be impossible to hide from corporate oversight or regulatory review. The custom manufacturing, specialized services, and exotic materials required for his operation would necessitate relationships with suppliers who should reasonably expect payment through normal business channels and documented transactions. The security requirements for protecting such sensitive vendor relationships would themselves require additional financial investment in legal services, security measures, and risk management that should be visible in corporate expense reports and budgetary allocations. The non-disclosure agreements, security protocols, and quality assurance measures associated with such specialized procurement would create administrative overhead that should significantly impact Wayne Enterprises' operational efficiency and profitability. The international banking and financial services required to support Batman's global activities would necessitate relationships with institutions that specialize in complex transactions and confidential services, typically associated with fees and requirements that should create additional documentation and regulatory exposure. The currency exchanges, wire transfers, and financial instruments required for international operations would generate audit trails that should make anonymity impossible. The opportunity costs associated with Bruce Wayne's time and attention represent perhaps the most fundamental economic impossibility in the entire Batman mythology, as his dual identity requires him to maintain peak performance in two completely different and equally demanding roles. The management of a major multinational corporation requires full-time attention from experienced executives supported by extensive staff and advisory resources, while Batman's activities similarly demand total commitment and focus that should make effective performance in either role impossible. The board of directors of Wayne Enterprises should reasonably expect their chief executive to demonstrate consistent availability, strategic focus, and operational oversight that would be incompatible with Batman's nocturnal schedule and frequent absences. The fiduciary obligations associated with corporate leadership create legal liabilities that should make Bruce Wayne's irregular availability and divided attention grounds for removal or legal action by shareholders and regulatory authorities. The physical demands of Batman's activities should similarly make it impossible to maintain the energy and mental acuity required for effective corporate leadership, as the sleep deprivation, stress, and physical punishment associated with nightly crime fighting would inevitably impact cognitive performance and decision-making capabilities. The medical and insurance requirements associated with executive positions should detect health issues and lifestyle factors that would raise questions about Bruce Wayne's suitability for corporate leadership. The social and networking requirements associated with both Bruce Wayne's public persona and Batman's operational needs create scheduling conflicts that should make it impossible to maintain credibility in either role. The charitable functions, business meetings, social obligations, and public appearances required to support Bruce Wayne's image would consume substantial time and energy that should interfere with Batman's training and operational requirements. The investment portfolio management required to maintain and grow Wayne family wealth would itself demand significant time and expertise, requiring constant monitoring of market conditions, strategic decision-making, and oversight of financial advisors and fund managers. The complexity of managing diversified investments across multiple asset classes, geographic regions, and economic sectors would create additional demands on Bruce Wayne's time and attention that should make his dual identity unsustainable. The estate planning and wealth management requirements associated with a fortune of Wayne family proportions would necessitate extensive legal and financial advisory relationships that should create additional complexity and potential exposure risks. The tax planning, succession planning, and asset protection strategies required to preserve such wealth across generations would require constant attention and strategic decision-making that should conflict with Batman's operational demands. In examining these myriad financial impossibilities and economic contradictions, we discover that Batman's fiscal foundation rests not upon realistic business principles but upon the mythological logic that governs heroic narratives, where material constraints yield to moral imperatives and ordinary limitations dissolve before extraordinary dedication. The mathematical impossibilities that surround Wayne Enterprises and Batman's operation serve not as flaws in storytelling but as evidence of the symbolic nature of wealth in superhero mythology, where money functions not as a finite resource but as an expression of the hero's unlimited commitment to his mission and the cosmic justice of his cause. In the shadowed annals of Gotham's chronicles, where death should mark the final chapter of any mortal tale, there exists instead a revolving door of resurrection and return that transforms the ultimate consequence into a temporary inconvenience, creating narrative contradictions so profound that they undermine the very foundations upon which dramatic tension and emotional investment depend. This macabre dance of death and revival has become perhaps the most glaring plot hole in Batman's mythology, a pattern of mortality, manipulation that renders meaningless the stakes of heroic sacrifice, while creating timeline paradoxes that no amount of exposition or retroactive continuity can adequately resolve. The most emblematic example of this resurrection paradox lies in the tragic and impossible story of Jason Todd, the second Robin whose death at the hands of the Joker was meant to serve as Batman's greatest failure and most haunting reminder of the costs associated with his war on crime. The original circumstances surrounding Jason's demise were crafted with deliberate finality, his beaten body discovered in the ruins of a warehouse explosion that should have left no possibility for survival or miraculous recovery. Yet within the span of comic book years that somehow translated to decades of real-world publication, the supposedly deceased Boy Wonder returned as the Red Hood, alive and embittered by his mentor's failure to avenge his death. The mechanisms offered to explain Jason's resurrection create their own web of contradictions and impossibilities that strain credibility far beyond the breaking point of suspended disbelief. The Lazarus Pit, that mystical pool of regenerative waters that serves as Ra's al Ghul's fountain of youth, supposedly restored Jason to life despite the fundamental problem that his body had been buried and should have undergone natural decomposition processes that would make meaningful resurrection impossible regardless of any supernatural intervention. The timeline surrounding Jason's death and subsequent revival creates mathematical impossibilities that become more complex with each attempt at explanation or clarification. If we accept the canonical account that Jason died as a teenager and remained dead for several years before his resurrection, his return should show him aged appropriately for the time that passed. Yet he appears essentially unchanged from his final moments as Robin. Alternatively, if his resurrection occurred shortly after his apparent death to explain his unchanged appearance, then his years of training and development as the Red Hood must have been compressed into an impossibly brief period. The psychological implications of Jason's return from the dead are treated with remarkable inconsistency across different storylines, sometimes acknowledging the profound trauma and existential confusion that should logically result from experiencing death and resurrection, while other times presenting him as essentially unaffected by what should be the most psychologically devastating experience imaginable. The Lazarus Pit's supposed side effect of inducing temporary madness in those it resurrects provides a convenient explanation for some of Jason's more extreme behavior. Yet this effect appears and disappears according to the needs of particular stories, rather than following any consistent pattern or logical progression. The broader implications of the Lazarus Pit's existence and apparent accessibility create their own category of narrative problems, as the availability of reliable resurrection technology should fundamentally alter the risk-benefit calculations that govern superhero behavior and villain motivations. If death can be routinely reversed through mystical means, the emotional weight of sacrifice and loss becomes meaningless, while the practical considerations that should influence tactical decisions lose their logical foundation. The selective application of resurrection technology creates glaring inconsistencies in terms of which characters benefit from such miraculous recovery and which remain permanently deceased, despite equally compelling reasons for revival. Batman's parents, Thomas and Martha Wayne, whose murders serve as the foundational trauma that drives his entire heroic mission, remain resolutely dead, despite the theoretical availability of resurrection methods that have proven effective for lesser characters whose deaths carried far less narrative significance. The failure to employ known resurrection techniques to restore beloved characters who have died heroic deaths creates plot holes that suggest either shocking callousness on the part of surviving heroes or fundamental limitations to resurrection technology that are never adequately explained or consistently applied. The emotional devastation experienced by Batman following Jason's death and his subsequent refusal to kill the Joker in revenge becomes significantly less meaningful if resurrection was always a possibility that simply required accessing the appropriate mystical or technological resources. The case of Stephanie Brown, who briefly served as both spoiler and the fourth Robin, before her apparent death during the crossover event known as War Games, demonstrates the arbitrary nature of death and resurrection in Batman's universe, while creating additional timeline complications that multiply existing continuity problems. Her supposed death was depicted with sufficient graphic detail and narrative finality to establish genuine stakes for her storyline, yet her eventual return was accomplished through retconning that revealed she had never actually died, but had instead been hidden away for medical treatment and recovery. This approach to undoing character death avoids the supernatural complications associated with resurrection, while creating different logical problems related to the conspiracy of silence and deception that would be necessary to maintain such an elaborate hoax. The medical professionals, law enforcement officials, and even close allies, who would necessarily be involved in staging and maintaining the deception of Stephanie's death, should leave documentary evidence and witness testimony that would make the truth impossible to conceal indefinitely. The psychological impact on characters who genuinely believed in Stephanie's death, including Batman himself and her other allies and friends, should create lasting trust issues and emotional complications that persist long after the revelation of her survival. The decision to allow loved ones to experience unnecessary grief and trauma for the sake of maintaining a deception whose purpose becomes increasingly unclear as time passes suggests either remarkably poor judgment or callous disregard for the emotional well-being of innocent parties. The resurrection of Oracle, the computer specialist persona adopted by Barbara Gordon after her paralysis at the hands of the Joker, represents another category of miraculous recovery that creates its own set of narrative contradictions and missed opportunities for meaningful character development. Barbara's eventual return to full physical capability and resumption of her Batgirl identity was accomplished through advanced medical technology and surgical techniques that supposedly restored function to her damaged spinal cord, yet the selective application of such revolutionary treatment raises questions about why similar technologies are not made available to other characters who suffer comparable injuries. The existence of medical technology capable of reversing spinal cord damage and restoring full neurological function should revolutionize treatment options for countless patients suffering from similar conditions. Yet such breakthroughs appear to exist only within the narrow confines of superhero narratives, rather than having any broader impact on medical practice or public health. The failure to commercialize or share such dramatic medical advances suggests either remarkable selfishness on the part of those who control the technology or artificial limitations that exist solely to prevent the logical consequences of such discoveries from affecting the broader fictional universe. The timeline associated with Barbara's recovery and return to active duty creates additional complications when considered alongside the aging and development of other characters, as her years of adaptation to disability and development of alternative methods for contributing to Batman's mission should have required significant time to accomplish. Yet her return to physical activity appears to occur without the extended rehabilitation period that would realistically be necessary to regain peak physical condition after years of paralysis. The pattern of selective resurrection extends beyond individual character deaths to encompass entire categories of supposedly deceased individuals whose return creates cascading effects that undermine previously established continuity and character development. The return of various villains who had been definitively killed in earlier storylines creates particular problems because their deaths often served as resolution to specific story arcs or character development for the heroes responsible for their defeat. The Joker's remarkable survival rate represents perhaps the most egregious example of death becoming meaningless through repetitive resurrection, as the Clown Prince of Crime has supposedly died or suffered injuries that should be fatal on numerous occasions throughout his career, yet invariably returns without adequate explanation for his survival or recovery. The lack of permanent consequences for what should be life-threatening injuries undermines the stakes of conflicts, while creating the impression that certain characters possess plot armor that renders them immune to genuine danger. The medical implications of the Joker's survival of various fatal injuries suggest either superhuman resilience that has never been adequately explained, or access to advanced medical technology and treatment options that remain mysteriously unavailable to other characters who suffer similar trauma. His repeated recovery from conditions that should result in permanent disability or death creates inconsistencies in his physical capabilities and mental state that vary according to the needs of individual storylines rather than following any logical progression or consequence. The broader roster of Gotham's criminal population demonstrates similar patterns of impossible survival and unexplained recovery from injuries and conditions that should permanently alter their capabilities or remove them from active criminal careers. Two-Face's extensive facial scarring and psychological trauma should require ongoing medical treatment and create physical limitations that affect his criminal activities. Yet he appears essentially unchanged from story to story, despite the accumulating damage that should result from repeated conflicts with Batman and law enforcement. The Penguin's various injuries and defeats over the years should similarly create cumulative effects that impact his ability to maintain his criminal empire and engage in physical confrontations. Yet he consistently returns to full effectiveness without visible consequences from his previous encounters. The failure to acknowledge or address the logical progression of injury and recovery creates an artificial stasis that prevents meaningful character development and renders previous conflicts meaningless. The resurrections that occur through supernatural or mystical means create their own category of logical problems related to the spiritual and metaphysical implications of death and return, as characters who have experienced genuine death should possess knowledge and perspective that fundamentally alters their worldview and behavior. The failure to address the philosophical and psychological ramifications of crossing the boundary between life and death represents a missed opportunity for meaningful character exploration, while creating inconsistencies in how resurrection affects different individuals. The selective memory loss that often accompanies resurrection serves as a convenient plot device to avoid addressing the complex implications of death experiences. Yet this mechanism creates its own logical problems related to the persistence of identity and consciousness across the death and revival process. If resurrection involves sufficient memory alteration to prevent traumatic recall of death experiences, then questions arise about whether the returned individual represents genuine continuity of consciousness or merely a copy with implanted memories. The various methods of resurrection that appear throughout Batman's mythology create an inconsistent cosmology that suggests multiple competing systems of life, death, and revival operating simultaneously within the same universe. The Lazarus Pit represents one approach to resurrection that operates according to mystical principles, while advanced medical technology provides another avenue for recovery from supposedly fatal conditions, and reality-altering events occasionally restore deceased individuals through temporal manipulation or universe-spanning retcons. The coexistence of these different resurrection mechanisms creates logical conflicts about which method should be most effective or readily available in any given situation, while the failure to establish clear rules or limitations for each approach makes it impossible to predict or understand the stakes associated with character deaths. The arbitrary application of different revival techniques according to story requirements rather than logical consistency undermines narrative tension while creating false drama around deaths that readers have learned to expect will be reversed. The economic implications of reliable resurrection technology should fundamentally alter insurance practices, medical research priorities, and social structures in ways that are never adequately addressed or acknowledged within the fictional universe. The availability of methods for reversing death should create massive demand for such services while generating enormous profits for those who control the necessary technology or mystical knowledge, yet these logical consequences remain unexplored. The legal implications of resurrection present their own category of complications, as individuals who have been legally declared dead and whose estates have been settled should face complex bureaucratic and judicial processes when they return to life. The restoration of legal identity, property rights, and social standing should require extensive documentation and legal proceedings that would make secret resurrections impossible to maintain. Yet returned characters typically resume their previous lives without apparent legal obstacles. The insurance implications of resurrections should similarly create massive fraud investigations and policy revisions that would fundamentally alter how death benefits and life insurance operate within the fictional universe. The ability to return from apparent death should trigger extensive fraud investigations while creating precedents that would revolutionize insurance industry practices, yet these logical consequences are consistently ignored. The medical implications extend beyond individual resurrections to encompass broader questions about the nature of death itself and the criteria used to determine when life has truly ended. The availability of resurrection technology should drive advances in emergency medicine and trauma treatment that would significantly improve survival rates for ordinary injuries and medical conditions. Yet such improvements remain limited to the supernatural, rather than affecting general medical practice. The scientific study of resurrection phenomena should generate tremendous research, interest, and funding as medical professionals and scientists attempt to understand and replicate the mechanisms that enable return from death, yet such investigations are never depicted or acknowledged. The failure to pursue scientific understanding of resurrection suggests either remarkable lack of curiosity on the part of the medical community or deliberate concealment of information that would have revolutionary implications for human health and longevity. In contemplating these myriad contradictions and impossibilities surrounding death and resurrection in Batman's universe, we recognize that the arbitrary nature of mortality serves not realistic storytelling purposes, but rather the mythological requirements of ongoing heroic narratives that must maintain dramatic stakes while preserving beloved characters for future storylines. The revolving door of death and return reflects the commercial and creative pressures that govern long-running series rather than logical consistency or meaningful exploration of mortality's implications, creating a fictional universe where death becomes not the ultimate consequence, but merely another temporary setback in the endless cycle of heroic adventure. In the labyrinthine deceptions that form the foundation of superhero mythology, there exists perhaps no greater testament to the willing suspension of disbelief than the collective blindness that surrounds the secret identities of Gotham's protectors, a phenomenon so pervasive and logically impossible that it transforms every citizen of the city into either a willing conspirator or an individual suffering from the most profound form of selective perception disorder ever documented in human history. The mechanics of secret identity preservation in Batman's universe operate according to principles that defy not merely common sense and basic observational skills, but the fundamental capabilities of modern technology, facial recognition systems, and the simple human capacity for pattern recognition that should make anonymity impossible for anyone engaging in such highly visible public activities. The most immediately apparent impossibility lies in Bruce Wayne's ability to conceal his identity through the simple expedient of removing his costume, despite possessing one of the most distinctive and recognizable jawlines in the history of human physiognomy. The lower half of Batman's face, which remains visible beneath his cowl during every public appearance, displays bone structure and facial characteristics so unique and memorable that they should serve as an unmistakable fingerprint for anyone with even rudimentary observational skills. Yet somehow the citizens of Gotham, the law enforcement officials who work alongside him, and even the criminals who face him in combat consistently fail to recognize features that should be as identifiable as any photograph. The mathematical impossibility becomes even more pronounced when we consider that Bruce Wayne maintains an extremely high public profile as one of Gotham's most prominent citizens, appearing regularly at charity functions, business meetings, social gatherings, and media events where his face is photographed, filmed, and observed by thousands of individuals who should logically possess extensive familiarity with his appearance. The suggestion that none of these observers would notice the obvious correlation between Bruce Wayne's facial features and those displayed by Batman during his nightly activities requires a level of collective obliviousness that borders on the supernatural. The voice recognition problem presents an even more glaring logical failure, as Bruce Wayne makes no apparent effort to significantly alter his vocal patterns, speech rhythms, or linguistic characteristics when adopting his Batman persona. While he may lower his voice to a gravelly whisper or adopt a more intimidating tone, the fundamental acoustic properties that make each individual's voice unique should remain detectable to anyone with extensive exposure to both identities. Yet characters who interact regularly with both Bruce Wayne and Batman never seem to notice the obvious similarities. The technological solutions that should make voice recognition trivial in the modern era create additional layers of impossibility. As law enforcement agencies, intelligence organizations, and even private security firms routinely employ sophisticated audio analysis software capable of identifying individuals through vocal biometrics even when they attempt deliberate disguise or alteration. The failure of Gotham's police department, the FBI, or any other investigative organization to employ such readily available technology to determine Batman's identity suggests either remarkable incompetence or deliberate ignorance that raises questions about their professional capabilities and institutional integrity. The physical characteristics that should make Bruce Wayne's identity transparent extend far beyond facial features and vocal patterns to encompass his overall body structure, movement patterns, and distinctive physical mannerisms that should be impossible to completely disguise or alter. The height, weight, and general proportions that define Bruce Wayne's physique are clearly visible in both his civilian and superhero appearances. Yet somehow these obvious correlations escape the notice of individuals who should be professionally trained in observation and identification techniques. The movement patterns and combat techniques that Batman displays during his activities reflect years of specialized training in martial arts, acrobatics, and tactical operations that should leave distinctive signatures in his physical behavior and fighting style. The suggestion that Bruce Wayne could completely conceal such extensive physical conditioning and specialized skills during his civilian interactions requires either acting abilities that surpass those of the world's greatest performers or a level of collective blindness among his observers that defies psychological and neurological understanding. The scheduling impossibilities that should make Bruce Wayne's dual identity transparent to anyone with basic analytical skills represent another category of logical failure that undermines the entire secret identity concept. Batman's activities occur primarily during nighttime hours and frequently extend well into the early morning, creating sleep deprivation and fatigue that should be visible in Bruce Wayne's daytime appearances and professional performance. Yet he consistently maintains the energy levels and mental acuity expected of a successful business executive and social figure. The correlation between Batman's appearances and Bruce Wayne's absences from public events should create obvious patterns that even casual observers would notice over time, particularly given the frequency with which major criminal activities and superhero interventions occur during precisely the same periods when Bruce Wayne is mysteriously unavailable for comment or participation in scheduled activities. The failure of journalists, business associates, and social acquaintances to notice or investigate these coincidences suggests either remarkable lack of curiosity or deliberate avoidance of obvious questions. The medical implications of maintaining Batman's physically demanding schedule while fulfilling Bruce Wayne's social and professional obligations should create health consequences that would be impossible to conceal from close associates and medical professionals. The injuries sustained during Batman's activities, ranging from minor cuts and bruises to serious trauma requiring medical attention, should necessitate explanations and treatment that would create documentary evidence of his dual identity. The explanation that Bruce Wayne covers his injuries through claims of athletic activities, accident-prone tendencies, or recreational sports participation becomes increasingly implausible when considered across the extended timeline of his career and the frequency with which such injuries occur. Medical professionals treating serious or recurring injuries should reasonably demand more detailed explanations and implement preventive measures that would interfere with Batman's operational capabilities. Yet such logical medical responses never seem to occur. The psychological profile changes that should be apparent in Bruce Wayne's behavior as he adapts to the stresses and experiences of his Batman identity represent another category of observable evidence that should make his secret identity transparent to anyone with psychological training or extensive personal knowledge. The trauma associated with repeatedly witnessing violence, engaging in life-threatening combat, and bearing responsibility for others' safety should create measurable changes in personality, stress responses, and social interaction patterns that would be impossible to completely conceal from close friends and family members. The compartmentalization required to maintain such dramatically different personas should itself create psychological strain and behavioral inconsistencies that trained observers would recognize as indicators of significant internal conflict or identity dissociation. The failure of mental health professionals, close personal relationships, and even casual observers To notice such obvious psychological indicators suggests either remarkable professional incompetence or willful blindness that defies understanding. The technological infrastructure that supports modern society should make secret identity maintenance impossible through multiple independent verification systems that operate without requiring deliberate investigation or suspicious behavior. Facial recognition systems embedded in security cameras, automatic license plate readers, credit card transaction monitoring, cell phone location tracking, and countless other surveillance technologies should create comprehensive activity logs that would make it impossible to maintain separate identities without detection. The failure of these ubiquitous monitoring systems to detect the correlation between Bruce Wayne's movements and Batman's appearances suggests either remarkable technological incompetence on the part of law enforcement and security agencies or the operation of counter-surveillance capabilities that would themselves require explanation and justification. The development and deployment of technology sufficient to defeat modern surveillance systems would represent a significant undertaking that should leave its own evidence trail and raise questions about its purposes and applications. The financial transaction patterns that should make Bruce Wayne's dual identity obvious through economic analysis represent another category of evidence that modern investigative techniques should routinely detect and analyze. The procurement of specialized equipment, materials, and services required for Batman's operations should create purchasing patterns, vendor relationships, and financial flows that would be impossible to completely conceal from forensic accounting and financial intelligence analysis. The explanation that Wayne Enterprises' research and development activities provide cover for Batman-related purchases becomes increasingly implausible when subjected to detailed analysis, as corporate procurement procedures, budgetary oversight, and regulatory compliance requirements should create documentation trails that would expose unusual or inappropriate expenditures. The failure of corporate boards, regulatory agencies, and financial oversight authorities to detect and investigate such obvious anomalies suggests systemic failures in corporate governance that should have broader implications beyond secret identity preservation. The international activities and relationships that Batman maintains through his Justice League involvement should create additional evidence trails that would make his civilian identity transparent to intelligence agencies and international law enforcement organizations. The coordination required for global superhero activities, the travel logistics associated with international missions, and the communication requirements for maintaining such relationships should generate electronic signatures and operational patterns that would be impossible to conceal from sophisticated intelligence analysis. The diplomatic immunity and legal protections that would be necessary to facilitate international superhero activities should require official recognition and documentation that would expose the civilian identities of team members to government scrutiny and oversight. The alternative explanation that such activities occur without official sanction or knowledge would represent violations of international law and sovereignty that should trigger massive diplomatic and legal consequences. The social relationships and personal connections that Bruce Wayne maintains while conducting his Batman activities create logical impossibilities related to time management, emotional availability, and psychological consistency that should be obvious to anyone with intimate knowledge of his civilian persona. The romantic relationships, friendships, and family connections that define Bruce Wayne's public identity require emotional investment and time commitment that should be incompatible with the demands of his superhero career. The failure of romantic partners, close friends, and family members to recognize the obvious signs of Bruce Wayne's dual identity suggests either remarkable lack of intimacy in these relationships or willful ignorance that would undermine the authenticity of emotional connections. The alternative explanation, that Bruce Wayne successfully maintains genuine, intimate relationships while concealing such a fundamental aspect of his identity, would require deception skills that border on the sociopathic, while creating psychological compartmentalization that should prevent authentic emotional connection. The media attention that both Bruce Wayne and Batman attract should create sufficient documentation and analysis to make their correlation obvious to investigative journalists, particularly those specializing in crime reporting or celebrity coverage. The photographic and video evidence available from public appearances should provide ample material for detailed comparison and analysis, while the behavioral patterns and schedule correlations should create story leads that professional journalists would naturally pursue. The failure of Gotham's media establishment to investigate or even notice the obvious connections between Bruce Wayne and Batman suggests either remarkable professional incompetence or deliberate suppression of information that raises questions about press freedom and investigative integrity. The alternative explanation, that such investigations occur but are systematically prevented from publication, would require conspiracy-level coordination that should leave its own evidence trail. The criminal intelligence networks that operate within Gotham should possess both the motivation and capability to determine Batman's identity through systematic observation and analysis. As such, knowledge would provide enormous tactical advantages in planning crimes and avoiding capture. The failure of sophisticated criminal organizations to employ basic surveillance and intelligence techniques to identify their primary opponent suggests either remarkable strategic incompetence or deliberate avoidance of information that would fundamentally alter their operational approaches. The international criminal networks and intelligence organizations that Batman encounters through his global activities should similarly possess the resources and expertise necessary to penetrate his secret identity through professional intelligence analysis. The failure of such organizations to employ standard intelligence techniques to identify and exploit Batman's civilian vulnerabilities represents a strategic oversight that defies understanding given the obvious tactical advantages such knowledge would provide. The pattern recognition capabilities that should make secret identity maintenance impossible extend beyond human observation to encompass artificial intelligence systems and automated analysis tools that operate without the cognitive biases and selective attention limitations that might theoretically explain human failures to recognize obvious correlations. The failure of such systems to detect and report the obvious connections between civilian and superhero identities suggests either deliberate programming limitations or technological capabilities that somehow fall short of their demonstrated performance in other analytical applications. The cumulative effect of these myriad logical impossibilities and observational failures creates a secret identity preservation system that requires not merely the suspension of disbelief, but the complete abandonment of rational analysis and empirical observation. The collective blindness that enables Bruce Wayne to maintain his dual identity represents a form of selective perception so profound and pervasive that it suggests either supernatural intervention or a level of societal dysfunction that should have broader implications for Gotham's ability to function as a modern urban environment. In contemplating these fundamental impossibilities that surround secret identity logic in Batman's universe, we recognize that the preservation of anonymity serves not realistic storytelling purposes, but rather the mythological requirements of heroic narratives that must maintain clear distinctions between civilian and superhero identities. Despite the logical impossibility of such separation in the modern world, the willing blindness that protects secret identities reflects not plausible human behavior, but rather the necessary suspension of critical analysis that allows audiences to engage with heroic fantasies that would collapse under realistic scrutiny, creating a fictional framework where the impossible becomes acceptable through collective agreement to ignore obvious contradictions in favor of dramatic necessity. In the shadowed corridors of Arkham Asylum, where the most dangerous criminals in Gotham's history are supposedly contained behind walls of reinforced concrete and bars of hardened steel, there exists a security failure so systematic and comprehensive that it transforms the very concept of incarceration from a method of protecting society into an elaborate revolving door that serves no purpose beyond providing temporary inconvenience to individuals whose repeated escapes have become as predictable as the changing seasons. This institutional catastrophe represents perhaps the most glaring plot hole in Batman's entire mythology, a pattern of security breaches so frequent and methodical that they suggest either criminal negligence on the part of those responsible for the facility's operation, or deliberate collusion between the staff and inmates that would constitute conspiracy on a scale that defies rational explanation. The fundamental impossibility of Arkham's security record becomes apparent when one considers the mathematical probability of the escape patterns that characterize the facility's operational history, as major breakouts occur with such regularity that they should trigger immediate federal intervention and complete administrative reorganization, rather than the casual acceptance and routine recapture procedures that seem to define the institutional response. The Joker alone has supposedly escaped from Arkham's maximum security wards dozens of times throughout his criminal career, each incident involving the circumvention of multiple security layers, surveillance systems, and containment protocols that were specifically designed to prevent exactly the type of breach he consistently accomplishes with apparent ease. The methodology employed in these repeated escapes demonstrates a level of institutional learning and adaptation that should theoretically make subsequent attempts increasingly difficult, as each successful breakout should result in comprehensive security reviews, upgraded containment measures, and revised protocols that address the specific vulnerabilities exploited during previous incidents. Yet somehow the same criminals continue to employ variations of identical escape techniques, suggesting either remarkable creativity in discovering new applications for old methods or systematic failures in security assessment and improvement that would be grounds for criminal prosecution of administrative personnel. The Riddler's escapes present particularly egregious examples of security failure, as his methods typically involve elaborate puzzles and intellectual challenges that require extended periods of preparation and implementation, creating obvious opportunities for detection and intervention that somehow go unnoticed by supposedly trained security personnel. The construction of complex mechanical devices, the preparation of cryptographic messages, and the coordination of external resources necessary for his escape attempts should be impossible to accomplish within the monitored environment of a maximum security psychiatric facility. Yet these activities apparently occur without triggering any security alerts or preventive responses. The timeline requirements for planning and executing the elaborate schemes that characterize most Arkham escapes should make such attempts virtually impossible within the constraints of institutional supervision and monitoring that govern maximum security facilities. The Penguin's escapes, for instance, often involve coordination with external criminal networks, procurement of specialized equipment, and implementation of complex logistical plans that would require weeks or months of preparation time during which his activities should be under constant observation and documentation. The physical impossibilities associated with many documented escape attempts suggest either fundamental flaws in Arkham's architectural design or supernatural capabilities on the part of the inmates that have never been adequately acknowledged or explained. Two-Face's ability to navigate the facility's security systems and bypass multiple checkpoints, despite his distinctive appearance and documented psychological instabilities, should be prevented by basic security protocols that account for the specific threat profiles of individual inmates. The technological surveillance that should make escape attempts impossible in any modern correctional facility appears to function selectively or not at all within Arkham's walls. As security cameras consistently fail to detect suspicious activities, motion sensors somehow ignore obvious movement patterns, and electronic monitoring systems regularly malfunction at precisely the moments when their operation would prevent successful breakouts. The suggestion that such technological failures occur through coincidence rather than deliberate sabotage strains credibility beyond any reasonable threshold. The staffing patterns and personnel management practices at Arkham Asylum suggest either remarkable incompetence in hiring and supervision or systematic corruption that extends throughout the institutional hierarchy, as the same security guards, orderlies, and administrative personnel consistently fail to prevent escapes, despite repeated exposure to identical tactics and methods. The psychological profiles and background investigations that should be standard procedures for correctional facility employment appear to be either inadequate or completely absent, allowing individuals with questionable loyalties or compromised judgment to maintain positions that provide access to critical security information and operational procedures. The medical and psychiatric staff who supposedly treat Arkham's inmates face ethical and professional obligations that should prevent them from participating in or ignoring activities that facilitate escape attempts. Yet, the frequency of successful breakouts suggests either remarkable professional blindness or active collaboration with criminal patients. The therapeutic relationships that psychiatrists and medical personnel develop with dangerous inmates create obvious opportunities for manipulation and coercion that should be addressed through rigorous professional protocols and oversight mechanisms. The legal framework that governs Arkham's operations and the commitment procedures that place criminals within its walls creates additional categories of impossibility related to due process, patient rights, and institutional accountability that should prevent the casual recycling of dangerous offenders through a system that demonstrably fails to contain or treat them effectively. The repeated commitment of individuals who have established patterns of escape and recidivism should trigger legal challenges and systemic reforms that address the fundamental failures in both security and treatment outcomes. The insanity defense mechanisms that enable criminals to avoid traditional incarceration in favor of psychiatric treatment create perverse incentives that should logically result in massive increases in defendants claiming mental illness to access the apparently more lenient security environment of Arkham Asylum. The failure of the criminal justice system to recognize and address the obvious security deficiencies that make Arkham a more attractive option than conventional maximum security prisons suggests either systematic ignorance of documented escape patterns or deliberate policy decisions that prioritize other considerations over public safety. The repeat offender patterns that characterize Arkham's most notorious inmates should trigger enhanced security measures and specialized containment protocols that account for their demonstrated escape capabilities and recidivism rates. Yet somehow these individuals continue to receive standard treatment that has proven inadequate through multiple previous failures. The Joker's ability to repeatedly escape and commit mass murder should result in permanent isolation measures and enhanced security protocols that make future escapes impossible regardless of cost or institutional convenience. The mass breakout events that periodically affect Arkham's entire inmate population represent security failures so comprehensive that they suggest either complete institutional collapse or coordinated inside assistance that would constitute criminal conspiracy involving multiple staff members and administrative personnel. The coordination required to simultaneously release dozens of maximum security inmates while neutralizing multiple security systems and personnel should be impossible to accomplish without extensive planning and institutional knowledge that could only come from staff participation. The psychological impact of repeated escapes on Arkham's staff should create staff retention problems and recruitment difficulties that would severely compromise the facility's operational capability, as competent professionals would reasonably seek employment in institutions with better security records and lower personal risk factors. The failure to address these obvious personnel challenges suggests either artificial employment incentives that compensate for increased risk or systematic misrepresentation of the facility's actual security record to potential employees. The insurance and liability implications of Arkham's escape record should make the facility uninsurable through conventional means and create massive legal exposure for the state and municipal authorities responsible for its operation, as the damage caused by escaped inmates creates clear causal relationships between institutional failures and public harm that should result in significant financial consequences. The failure of insurance companies and legal systems to address these obvious liability issues suggests either artificial protections or systematic avoidance of accountability that defies standard risk management and legal precedent. The federal oversight and intervention that should automatically result from such systematic security failures appears to be either absent or ineffective, as agencies responsible for correctional facility standards and public safety should reasonably intervene when state-level institutions demonstrate such obvious inability to fulfill their basic containment functions. The continued operation of Arkham, despite its documented failure rate, suggests either federal incompetence or political considerations that override public safety concerns. The alternative containment options that should be explored and implemented when standard psychiatric facilities prove inadequate include military detention facilities, federal maximum security prisons, and specialized containment sites designed specifically for individuals with demonstrated supernatural or exceptional capabilities. The failure to transfer repeat escape offenders to more secure facilities suggests either legal obstacles that prevent appropriate risk management or institutional pride that prioritizes jurisdictional control over effective containment. The international precedents for managing dangerous criminals with exceptional capabilities should provide guidance and best practices that could be adapted to address Arkham's specific challenges, yet there appears to be no evidence of research into or implementation of proven techniques from other jurisdictions that have successfully contained similar threats. The isolation of Arkham's approach from broader correctional and psychiatric best practices suggests either institutional arrogance or systemic factors that prevent learning and adaptation. The technological solutions that should be available through government and private sector resources include advanced surveillance systems, automated containment protocols, and specialized security measures that could significantly improve escape prevention without requiring massive increases in personnel or administrative complexity. The failure to implement such technologies suggests either budgetary constraints that reflect misplaced priorities or resistance to modernization that prioritizes traditional approaches over demonstrated effectiveness. The research opportunities that Arkham's unique inmate population should provide for advancing understanding of criminal psychology, security technology, and containment methodologies represent valuable assets that could generate funding and expertise to improve facility operations while contributing to broader public safety knowledge. The failure to leverage these research opportunities suggests either lack of academic and professional connections or institutional focus that prevents recognition of such possibilities. The public relations catastrophe that Arkham's escape record should create for municipal and state authorities responsible for public safety should generate political pressure for immediate and comprehensive reforms that address both security deficiencies and administrative accountability. Yet somehow, these obvious political vulnerabilities do not appear to influence policy decisions or resource allocation priorities. The continuation of failed policies despite clear public safety consequences suggests either political systems that do not respond to obvious performance failures or deliberate decisions to accept known risks for undisclosed reasons. The media attention that should focus on Arkham's systematic failures and their consequences for public safety should create investigative reporting opportunities that expose administrative incompetence and generate public pressure for immediate reforms. Yet the facility somehow continues to operate without sustained journalistic scrutiny or public accountability measures. The failure of news organizations to pursue such obvious stories suggests either access restrictions or editorial decisions that prevent coverage of important public safety issues. The economic costs associated with repeated escapes, including law enforcement responses, property damage, victim compensation, and administrative overhead, should create compelling financial incentives for implementing effective security improvements rather than continuing to absorb the ongoing expenses associated with systematic institutional failure. The apparent willingness to accept these recurring costs rather than investing in permanent solutions suggests either budget structures that do not account for total system costs or decision-making processes that prioritize short-term considerations over long-term effectiveness. In examining these myriad impossibilities and systematic failures that characterize Arkham Asylum's operations, we discover that the revolving door of criminal incarceration serves not realistic correctional purposes, but rather the narrative requirements of ongoing heroic adventures that must provide a renewable supply of familiar villains for Batman to confront and defeat. The institutional incompetence that enables repeated escapes reflects not plausible administrative failure, but rather the mythological logic that governs superhero storytelling, where consequences must remain temporary and threats must persist indefinitely to sustain dramatic tension across countless stories and decades of publication, creating a fictional framework where public safety yields to entertainment value and logical consistency becomes subordinate to the perpetual cycle of conflict and resolution that defines the superhero genre. In the cartographic impossibilities that define Gotham City's existence within the broader geography of the DC universe, there lurk contradictions so profound and spatial paradoxes so bewildering that they challenge not merely our understanding of urban planning and municipal development, but the very foundations of physical reality and the basic principles that govern how cities can exist within coherent geographical frameworks. This metropolitan enigma represents perhaps the most fundamentally disorienting aspect of Batman's mythology, a collection of architectural impossibilities and geographic contradictions that would render any real city uninhabitable, while creating logistical challenges that should make effective law enforcement and emergency services completely impossible. The most immediately apparent manifestation of Gotham's geographic impossibility lies in its mysteriously shifting location relative to other major population centers within the DC universe, as different stories place the city in configurations that would require it to exist simultaneously in multiple locations, or possess the ability to relocate itself across vast distances, according to the narrative requirements of particular storylines. Various canonical accounts have positioned Gotham as a neighbor to Metropolis, sometimes separated by a bay that can be crossed by bridge or tunnel, while other stories suggest distances that would require hours of travel by conventional transportation methods, creating a spatial relationship that defies consistent mapping or logical transportation planning. The proximity between Gotham and Metropolis becomes particularly problematic when one considers the practical implications of having two major metropolitan areas with dramatically different crime rates, economic conditions, and superhero protection levels existing within commuting distance of each other. The suggestion that Superman's presence in Metropolis creates a zone of relative safety and prosperity, while Gotham remains perpetually plagued by crime and corruption, raises obvious questions about population migration patterns, property values, and economic development that should naturally occur when such disparate conditions exist in neighboring cities. The failure of Gotham's residents to relocate to the demonstrably safer environment of nearby Metropolis suggests either artificial barriers to migration that are never adequately explained, or psychological attachments to their crime-ridden hometown that defy rational risk assessment and basic survival instincts. The alternative explanation that the economic opportunities and quality of life in Gotham somehow compensate for the extraordinary personal danger associated with residing there would require employment markets and civic amenities so superior to those available elsewhere that they justify accepting risks that no reasonable person would tolerate. The internal geography of Gotham itself presents even more bewildering contradictions, as the city appears to expand and contract according to the needs of individual stories, sometimes appearing as a relatively compact urban center that Batman can traverse quickly during his nightly patrols, while other narratives suggest a sprawling metropolis whose size would rival the largest cities in the world and require travel times that would make effective crime fighting impossible for any individual, regardless of their capabilities or technological resources. The architectural impossibilities that characterize Gotham's skyline and urban development patterns suggest either wholesale violations of engineering principles and building codes, or the operation of construction techniques that transcend normal limitations of materials, science, and structural engineering. The Gothic spires, elaborate gargoyles, and ornate facades that define the city's distinctive appearance would require construction costs and maintenance expenditures that should make such buildings economically unfeasible, yet they appear throughout the city in numbers that suggest either unlimited construction budgets or building techniques that achieve decorative complexity at no additional cost. The prevalence of Art Deco and Gothic Revival architecture throughout Gotham creates temporal inconsistencies that suggest the city was built during a specific historical period, yet continues to expand and develop using architectural styles that should have been abandoned decades ago in favor of more modern and cost-effective approaches. The suggestion that new construction continues to employ expensive and labor-intensive decorative elements while maintaining consistency with existing architectural themes, requires either municipal planning codes so restrictive that they would significantly increase development costs, or cultural preferences so strong that they override normal economic considerations. The underground infrastructure that supports Gotham's extensive tunnel systems, subway networks, and subterranean facilities presents engineering challenges that should be impossible to address within any realistic municipal budget or geological framework. The Batcave's existence beneath Wayne Manor suggests geological formations that would be extremely rare and valuable for mining or other commercial applications. Yet these natural resources appear to remain undeveloped and unexploited by anyone other than Batman, despite their obvious economic potential. The extensive tunnel networks that various criminals use for transportation and hiding places require excavation and construction work that should be detectable through seismic monitoring, utility mapping, and routine infrastructure maintenance activities. Yet these underground developments apparently occur without triggering any municipal oversight or regulatory intervention. The failure of city planning departments, utility companies, and construction authorities to detect and address unauthorized underground development suggests either systematic corruption or administrative incompetence that should have broader implications for municipal functionality. The transportation infrastructure that serves Gotham creates its own category of impossibilities related to traffic management, emergency response times, and the basic logistics of moving people and goods throughout such a large and complex urban environment. The frequency with which Batman arrives at crime scenes within minutes of their occurrence suggests either extraordinarily efficient transportation systems or supernatural abilities that enable him to traverse vast distances in impossibly short time frames. The bridge and tunnel systems that connect Gotham to other regions appear and disappear according to story requirements rather than following consistent geographic logic, as some narratives suggest the city is located on an island or peninsula that requires specific transportation links to access external areas, while other stories imply direct land connections that would make such infrastructure unnecessary. The inconsistent portrayal of Gotham's relationship to surrounding geography makes it impossible to develop coherent understanding of how the city functions within broader regional transportation and economic networks. The harbor facilities and waterfront infrastructure that support Gotham's maritime activities present their own set of logistical impossibilities, as the city appears to possess extensive shipping capabilities and naval access, while also maintaining the kind of isolated, atmospheric quality that would be inconsistent with major port operations. The coexistence of active commercial shipping with the Gothic atmosphere and criminal activity that characterize most portrayals of Gotham's waterfront suggests either remarkable compartmentalization of municipal functions or artificial separation of economic and criminal activities that defy realistic urban development patterns. The weather patterns that affect Gotham demonstrate selective meteorological behavior that operates according to dramatic necessity rather than geographic consistency or climatic logic, as storms, fog, and atmospheric conditions appear precisely when they would enhance the mood or provide tactical advantages for particular storylines. The city's apparently permanent overcast skies and frequent precipitation suggest either a microclimate so unique that it defies regional weather patterns, or atmospheric manipulation that operates through unknown technological or supernatural means. The crime distribution patterns throughout Gotham's various neighborhoods and districts create demographic and sociological impossibilities that challenge basic understanding of urban development and population dynamics, as certain areas appear to be exclusively inhabited by criminals and their victims, while other sections maintain the kind of normal civic and commercial activity that should be impossible in such a dangerous environment. The coexistence of functional business districts, residential neighborhoods, and criminal territories within the same municipal boundaries suggests either remarkable social stratification or artificial barriers that prevent the natural spread of criminal activity into more prosperous areas. The economic sustainability of businesses and institutions within Gotham's crime-ridden environment raises questions about insurance availability, employee retention, and customer behavior that should make normal commercial activity impossible. In areas where violence and property destruction occur with such frequency, the operation of banks, shops, restaurants, and other commercial establishments in neighborhoods where superhero battles and criminal activities regularly cause massive property damage suggests either insurance systems that operate according to unrealistic principles or economic incentives that compensate for extraordinary risk levels. The municipal services that Gotham somehow manages to maintain despite its crime problems present their own category of impossibilities related to employee safety, service delivery, and basic governmental functionality in an environment where public officials and service workers should face constant threats to their personal safety. The operation of fire departments, emergency medical services, utility maintenance crews, and other essential municipal functions requires personnel willing to work in extraordinarily dangerous conditions for compensation that should reflect such risk levels. The educational system that serves Gotham's children and young adults faces challenges that should make effective instruction impossible, as schools located in areas with high crime rates typically experience chronic problems with attendance, staff retention, and educational outcomes that reflect the broader social dysfunction in their communities. The apparent ability of some Gotham institutions to maintain high academic standards while operating in such a dangerous environment suggests either remarkable isolation from surrounding criminal activity or educational approaches that somehow transcend normal limitations imposed by social disorder. The healthcare infrastructure that serves Gotham's population must cope with trauma loads and emergency medical situations that would overwhelm normal hospital systems and require specialized resources that few medical centers could afford to maintain on a permanent basis. The frequency of injuries resulting from superhero battles, criminal violence, and industrial accidents should create demand for trauma services that exceeds the capacity of any reasonable number of medical facilities. Yet somehow the city's healthcare system continues to function without apparent resource constraints or capacity limitations. The population dynamics that govern Gotham's demographic patterns present mathematical impossibilities related to birth rates, death rates, and migration flows that should result in either rapid population decline as residents flee to safer areas, or demographic changes that reflect the extraordinary mortality risks associated with living in such a dangerous environment. The apparent stability of Gotham's population despite constant violence and destruction suggests either artificial barriers to migration or psychological factors that override normal self-preservation instincts. The real estate markets that operate within Gotham should reflect the crime rates and safety concerns that characterize different neighborhoods through property values and development patterns that make dangerous areas increasingly affordable while driving up prices in safer districts. Yet the city appears to maintain relatively stable property markets that do not adequately reflect the obvious risks associated with different locations. The failure of real estate prices to respond appropriately to crime patterns suggests either artificial market interventions or information failures that prevent buyers and renters from making informed decisions about personal safety. The tourism and convention industries that should be completely absent from a city with Gotham's reputation for violence and danger somehow continue to operate and attract visitors who either remain unaware of the obvious risks or possess motivations for visiting that override normal safety concerns. The operation of hotels, restaurants, entertainment venues, and other businesses that depend on visitors from outside the city suggests either systematic misrepresentation of local conditions or tourist populations with remarkable tolerance for personal danger. The industrial infrastructure that supports Gotham's economy presents its own set of impossibilities related to worker safety, environmental regulations, and operational security. In an environment where industrial facilities regularly become targets for criminal activity or suffer damage from superhero battles, the chemical plants, manufacturing facilities, and research installations that operate within the city should face insurance costs and security requirements that would make profitable operation impossible. Yet these facilities continue to function and apparently generate sufficient revenue to justify continued operation. In contemplating these myriad geographic impossibilities and urban planning paradoxes that define Gotham City's existence, we recognize that the metropolitan environment serves not as a realistic urban setting, but rather as a symbolic landscape that embodies the psychological and thematic elements of Batman's mythology through architectural metaphor and Batman's geographic symbolism. The city's impossible characteristics reflect not flawed world-building, but rather the deliberate creation of an urban environment that operates according to dramatic necessity rather than realistic constraints, providing a setting that enhances the mythological dimensions of heroic storytelling while transcending the mundane limitations that would govern any actual metropolitan area, creating a fictional space where the impossible becomes inevitable, and where geography itself serves the narrative requirements of eternal struggle between order and chaos in the shadowed streets of an impossible city. In the shadowed laboratories and workshops where Batman's technological arsenal is conceived, designed, and manufactured, there exist contradictions so fundamental and scientific impossibilities so profound that they challenge not merely our understanding of engineering principles and research methodology, but the very foundations of how advanced technology operates within coherent physical laws and economic constraints. This technological paradox represents perhaps the most intellectually frustrating aspect of Batman's mythology, a collection of selective capabilities and inconsistent applications that would render any real-world research program completely ineffective, while creating scientific contradictions that no amount of funding or expertise could adequately resolve. The most immediately apparent manifestation of these technological impossibilities lies in Batman's inexplicably selective deployment of advanced capabilities, as his arsenal demonstrates mastery of cutting-edge techniques in certain applications, while remaining mysteriously limited in others that should be far simpler to achieve using the same underlying technologies. The Batcomputer, for instance, routinely performs data analysis and pattern recognition tasks that exceed the capabilities of any existing supercomputer system, processing vast quantities of information from multiple sources to generate insights and correlations that should require artificial intelligence systems decades ahead of current development. Yet this same technological marvel consistently fails to solve relatively straightforward investigative problems that should be trivial for such advanced analytical capabilities. The contradiction becomes even more pronounced when we consider the specific types of problems that the Batcomputer can and cannot solve, as its performance appears to vary according to dramatic necessity rather than consistent technological limitations or logical processing constraints. The system can apparently hack into secure government databases, penetrate sophisticated criminal networks, and analyze complex forensic evidence with supernatural efficiency, yet somehow remains unable to identify obvious suspects, detect simple patterns in criminal behavior, or provide basic investigative leads that should emerge naturally from its comprehensive data analysis capabilities. The facial recognition and identity matching systems that the Bat computer employs demonstrate similar patterns of selective functionality, as they can apparently identify obscure criminals from partial photographs, match suspects across multiple aliases and disguises, and track individuals through extensive surveillance networks, yet consistently fail to recognize obvious connections between civilian and costumed identities that should be immediately apparent to any competent pattern recognition algorithm. The failure of such advanced systems to detect the correlation between Bruce Wayne and Batman, or to identify other heroes and villains whose secret identities rely on minimal disguises, suggests either fundamental programming flaws or artificial limitations that serve narrative purposes rather than technological logic. The materials science achievements that enable Batman's equipment to function as depicted would require breakthrough discoveries in multiple fields simultaneously, including metallurgy, chemistry, electronics, and manufacturing techniques that should revolutionize entire industries and generate massive commercial applications far beyond superhero equipment. The armor materials used in the Batsuit, for example, must somehow provide protection against bullets, blades, explosions, and exotic energy weapons, while remaining flexible enough to permit natural movement and light enough to avoid impeding agility and stealth capabilities. The development of such materials would necessarily involve years of research, testing, and refinement using facilities and expertise that should be visible to the broader scientific community and generate patents, publications, and commercial interest that would make secrecy impossible to maintain. The failure of Wayne Enterprises to commercialize such revolutionary materials, or even to acknowledge their existence in corporate research reports and intellectual property filings, suggests either remarkable business incompetence or deliberate suppression of technologies that could benefit countless applications from military defense to civilian safety equipment. The energy storage and power generation systems that support Batman's various devices and vehicles demonstrate capabilities that violate fundamental principles of physics and thermodynamics, as they somehow provide unlimited power for extended periods while occupying minimal space and weight within the equipment they support. The grappling guns, communication systems, computer interfaces, and countless other devices that Batman employs during his activities would require power sources that exceed the energy density of any known battery technology, yet operate continuously, without apparent need for recharging or replacement. The miniaturization achievements required to incorporate such power systems into portable equipment would represent breakthrough advances in energy storage that should immediately attract attention from automotive manufacturers, electronics companies, and research institutions seeking to develop better batteries for commercial applications. The failure of such revolutionary energy technology to appear in consumer markets or industrial applications suggests either artificial barriers to commercialization or fundamental limitations that are never adequately explained within the fictional framework. The transportation technologies employed in Batman's various vehicles demonstrate performance characteristics that should require propulsion systems decades ahead of current automotive and aerospace development, incorporating capabilities that exceed those of military vehicles designed for similar applications. The Batmobile's acceleration, top speed, maneuverability, and durability suggest engine and drivetrain technologies that would revolutionize transportation industries if made available for commercial development. Yet these innovations remain exclusively applied to superhero activities, rather than generating the massive economic benefits that should result from such breakthrough capabilities. The Batwing and other aerial vehicles present even more dramatic technological contradictions, as their flight performance, stealth capabilities, and operational range exceed those of advanced military aircraft, while somehow avoiding the extensive regulatory oversight and air traffic control requirements that govern all aircraft operations within controlled airspace. The development of such advanced aviation technology should require compliance with federal aviation regulations, airworthiness certifications, and pilot licensing requirements that would make covert operation impossible without official government cooperation or systematic violation of aviation law. The stealth technologies that enable Batman's vehicles to operate undetected by radar, satellite surveillance, and other monitoring systems represent achievements that should be of enormous interest to military and intelligence organizations, as the ability to avoid detection would provide decisive advantages in numerous defense applications. The failure of government agencies to investigate, acquire, or regulate such advanced stealth capabilities suggests either systematic oversight failures or official cooperation that should leave documentary evidence and policy implications. The communications and surveillance systems that Batman employs demonstrate global reach and penetration capabilities that should require infrastructure, investments, and international agreements comparable to those needed for satellite, networks, and telecommunications systems, yet operate without apparent regulatory oversight or international coordination that would be necessary for such comprehensive coverage. The ability to monitor criminal activities, coordinate with allies, and access information networks worldwide would require either extensive cooperation with government and commercial communications providers, or the development of independent infrastructure that should be visible to intelligence agencies and regulatory authorities. The cryptographic and cybersecurity technologies that protect Batman's communications and data systems must somehow provide security that exceeds the capabilities of government and corporate systems, while remaining immune to attack by criminal organizations and hostile intelligence services that should possess substantial resources and expertise for conducting cyber warfare. The development of such advanced security technologies should generate commercial and military interest that would make exclusive application to superhero activities economically irrational and strategically questionable. The manufacturing capabilities required to produce Batman's equipment in sufficient quantities to support his operational requirements would necessitate production facilities, supply chains, and quality control systems that should be visible to industrial observers and regulatory authorities, yet somehow operate without leaving any documentary evidence or economic footprint that would expose their existence. The precision manufacturing, exotic materials processing, and specialized assembly techniques required for such equipment would demand facilities and expertise comparable to those used in aerospace and defense manufacturing. The research and development infrastructure that supports ongoing improvements and innovations in Batman's technology should require teams of scientists, engineers, and technicians whose work would generate intellectual property, research publications, and professional connections that would be impossible to completely conceal from academic and industrial communities. The failure of such extensive research activities to produce any visible evidence of their existence suggests either supernatural secrecy capabilities or systematic exclusion from normal scientific and professional networks. The testing and validation procedures that would be necessary to ensure reliability and safety of Batman's equipment should require extensive field trials, laboratory analysis, and performance evaluation that would generate data and documentation that should be impossible to completely suppress or conceal. The consequences of equipment failure during life-threatening situations should demand testing standards that exceed those used in most commercial and military applications, requiring documentation and oversight that would create extensive evidence trails. The maintenance and repair infrastructure required to keep Batman's technology operational would necessitate specialized facilities, replacement parts inventory, and technical expertise that should be visible to suppliers and service providers who support such activities, yet somehow operate without creating any commercial relationships or supply chain connections that would expose their existence to outside observation or investigation. The intellectual property implications of Batman's technological achievements should create patent portfolios and licensing opportunities that would be worth billions of dollars if commercialized appropriately. Yet Wayne Enterprises apparently makes no effort to monetize such valuable innovations or even to protect them through standard intellectual property mechanisms that would prevent competitors from developing similar capabilities through reverse engineering or independent research. The international technology transfer regulations and export control restrictions that govern advanced military and dual-use technologies should create significant legal obstacles to developing and deploying many of Batman's capabilities without appropriate government approvals and oversight. Yet his equipment apparently operates without triggering any regulatory scrutiny or compliance requirements that would be mandatory for such advanced systems. The environmental and safety testing that would be required for many of Batman's technologies should generate regulatory documentation and compliance records that would be impossible to conceal from environmental protection agencies and occupational safety authorities, particularly for equipment that involves exotic materials, energy systems, or chemical processes that could pose risks to human health or environmental safety. The insurance and liability implications of deploying untested and unregulated technology in situations that could affect public safety should create legal exposures that would require extensive documentation and risk management procedures that would be impossible to maintain without leaving evidence of their existence. Yet Batman's activities apparently generate no such complications or requirements, despite their obvious potential for causing unintended consequences. The cybersecurity vulnerabilities that should affect any advanced computer system create opportunities for hostile penetration and intelligence gathering that should make Batman's technology targets for criminal organizations and foreign intelligence services seeking to acquire or neutralize such capabilities. Yet his systems somehow remain immune to attacks that should be inevitable given their high value and strategic importance. The obsolescence and upgrade cycles that affect all technology should require continuous investment in research and development to maintain competitive advantages and operational effectiveness. Yet Batman's equipment somehow remains state-of-the-art indefinitely, without apparent need for major updates or replacements that would reflect normal technology, evolution, and improvement patterns. The training and education requirements for effectively operating such advanced technology should demand extensive technical knowledge and specialized skills that would be impossible to acquire and maintain, alongside the numerous other capabilities that Batman demonstrates. Yet he somehow achieves expert-level competence in multiple technical fields, while also maintaining peak physical conditioning and mastering countless other disciplines that should require full-time dedication to achieve and maintain. In examining these myriad technological contradictions and scientific impossibilities that surround Batman's equipment and capabilities, we discover that his selective technological mastery serves not realistic engineering purposes, but rather the mythological requirements of heroic narratives that must provide unlimited resources and capabilities while maintaining dramatic tension through arbitrary limitations that operate according to storytelling necessity rather than consistent scientific principles. The technological paradoxes that define Batman's arsenal reflect not flawed technical design, but rather the fundamental challenge of creating fictional technology that appears advanced and capable while remaining subordinate to narrative requirements that demand both unlimited potential and convenue limitation, resulting in a technological framework where scientific consistency yields to dramatic necessity and logical constraints become subordinate to the eternal requirements of heroic adventure in a universe where technology serves myth rather than mathematics. In the shadowed chambers of Wayne Manor, where the boundaries between mentorship and endangerment blur into moral ambiguities so profound that they challenge the very foundations of child welfare and responsible guardianship, there exists perhaps no greater ethical catastrophe than Batman's systematic recruitment and training of minors to serve as his partners in a war against crime that routinely exposes them to violence, trauma, and life-threatening situations that would constitute criminal child endangerment in any jurisdiction governed by rational legal principles. This pattern of juvenile exploitation represents the most morally indefensible aspect of Batman's mythology, creating legal impossibilities and psychological contradictions that transform what should be protective relationships into systematic abuse disguised as heroic mentorship. The fundamental impossibility of the Robin concept becomes immediately apparent when one considers the legal frameworks that govern child welfare and protection in any civilized society, as the deliberate training of minors to engage in violent confrontations with armed criminals would constitute multiple felonies, including child endangerment, contributing to the delinquency of a minor, and conspiracy to commit vigilante activities that violate numerous state and federal laws. The failure of child protective services, law enforcement agencies, and judicial authorities to intervene in such obvious cases of institutional child abuse suggests either systematic corruption of the entire legal system or willful blindness that defies professional obligations and moral responsibility. The timeline contradictions that surround the various Robin identities create mathematical impossibilities that become more complex with each attempt at chronological reconciliation, as the supposed duration of each partnership must somehow accommodate the extensive training periods, character development, and shared adventures that define these relationships, while also allowing for realistic aging and maturation of the young people involved. Dick Grayson's tenure as the original Robin supposedly spanned nearly a decade, during which he grew from a grief-stricken child into a capable young adult ready to assume his own heroic identity. Yet this extended partnership must somehow fit within the compressed timeline that governs all aspects of Batman's career. The training regimen that would be necessary to transform ordinary children into competent crime-fighting partners represents a form of childhood exploitation so severe that it would permanently alter their psychological development and social adaptation in ways that should render normal adult relationships and civilian careers impossible. The physical conditioning, combat training, tactical education, and psychological preparation required for such dangerous work would necessarily consume the entirety of their childhood and adolescence, leaving no time for normal educational experiences, social development, or exploration of interests and talents that might lead to alternative career paths. The academic education that these young people supposedly receive while serving as Robin creates logistical impossibilities related to attendance, performance, and social integration that should make normal schooling completely unfeasible given their nocturnal crime-fighting schedules and frequent absences for training and missions. The suggestion that they maintain acceptable grades and social relationships while simultaneously mastering advanced combat techniques and participating in life-threatening adventures, requires time management capabilities and energy, reserves that exceed human limitations, regardless of age or physical conditioning. The psychological impact of exposure to violence, death, and criminal behavior during formative developmental years should create trauma responses and behavioral problems that would be immediately apparent to teachers, counselors, and other adults responsible for their welfare. Yet somehow these obvious warning signs either go unnoticed or are systematically concealed through means that would require conspiracy-level coordination among educational and social service professionals. The legal guardianship arrangements that enable Bruce Wayne to maintain custody of these young people while simultaneously exposing them to extraordinary danger should trigger immediate intervention by family courts and child welfare agencies, as any reasonable evaluation of their living situation would reveal circumstances that no responsible guardian would permit and no legal system should tolerate. The failure of mandatory reporters, including teachers and medical professionals, to recognize and report obvious signs of child endangerment suggests either professional incompetence or systematic corruption that extends throughout the institutions responsible for protecting minors. The medical care required to treat injuries sustained during their crime-fighting activities should create documentary evidence and professional obligations that would make concealment of their dangerous lifestyle impossible, as healthcare providers who treat minors for trauma that suggests abuse or neglect are legally required to report such cases to appropriate authorities. The frequency and severity of injuries that should result from regular exposure to armed criminals and violent confrontations would establish clear patterns of endangerment that should trigger immediate protective interventions. The insurance and liability implications of allowing minors to participate in vigilante activities should create legal exposures so massive that no responsible adult would accept such risks without comprehensive legal protections and financial safeguards that would be impossible to obtain through legitimate channels. The potential for lawsuits, criminal prosecution, and civil liability should make the entire Robin concept legally and financially unsustainable, regardless of Bruce Wayne's wealth or legal resources. The emotional manipulation required to convince children to accept such dangerous roles suggests psychological techniques that border on brainwashing or indoctrination, as no rational young person would voluntarily choose to risk their life on a nightly basis without either coercion or systematic distortion of their understanding of risk and consequences. The exploitation of grief, trauma, and desire for revenge that characterizes most Robin origin stories represents predatory behavior that targets vulnerable children during their most psychologically fragile moments. The social isolation that inevitably results from maintaining secret identities while participating in dangerous activities should create developmental problems and relationship difficulties that persist throughout their adult lives, as the inability to form normal peer relationships or participate in age-appropriate activities would fundamentally alter their social and emotional development in ways that no amount of later therapy or adjustment could completely address. The different approaches that Batman supposedly employs with each successive Robin create inconsistencies that suggest either remarkable learning and adaptation or arbitrary changes in methodology that serve narrative purposes rather than reflecting genuine improvement in child welfare and safety practices. Dick Grayson's relatively positive relationship with his mentor contrasts sharply with the tragic fate of Jason Todd and the complex psychological issues that affect subsequent Robins. Yet these variations appear to result from external circumstances rather than systematic improvements in training or protection protocols. The failure to learn from previous tragedies and mistakes, particularly Jason Todd's death at the hands of the Joker, should logically result in immediate termination of the Robin program and comprehensive review of child safety practices. Yet Batman continues to recruit and train new young partners despite clear evidence that such relationships inevitably lead to trauma, danger, and potential death for the minors involved. The international legal complications that should arise from taking minors into dangerous situations across national boundaries create additional categories of legal exposure and regulatory oversight that should make global crime-fighting activities impossible without extensive governmental cooperation and legal immunity that would leave documentary evidence of official sanction for such activities. The educational and career opportunities that these young people sacrifice by dedicating their formative years to vigilante activities represent irreversible losses that should affect their adult prospects and life satisfaction in ways that raise questions about whether informed consent is possible when the decision-makers lack the maturity and life experience necessary to understand the full implications of their choices. The competitive dynamics and psychological pressure that must result from multiple young people competing for Batman's attention and approval should create unhealthy relationship patterns and emotional conflicts that would be apparent to any trained observer and should trigger professional intervention from mental health authorities responsible for protecting children from psychological abuse. The gender and diversity issues that emerge from examination of the Robin roster reveal selection criteria and training approaches that may reflect unconscious bias or deliberate preferences that would constitute discriminatory practices. In any legitimate educational or mentorship program, while the eventual inclusion of female and minority partners appears to occur more through external pressure than systematic recognition of previous exclusionary practices, the transition processes that former Robins undergo when aging out of their roles create psychological and practical challenges that should require extensive support services and professional counseling to address identity issues, career planning, and relationship difficulties that inevitably result from such unconventional upbringings. Yet these young adults somehow manage to achieve independence and success without apparent need for specialized assistance or therapeutic intervention. The financial support and resources that Bruce Wayne provides to former Robins should create dependency relationships and ethical obligations that persist long after their active partnerships end. Yet the economic implications of such ongoing support are never adequately addressed or acknowledged within the broader context of his other financial commitments and responsibilities. The recruitment methods that Batman employs to identify and attract potential Robin candidates suggest systematic targeting of vulnerable young people who have experienced trauma, loss, or social displacement that makes them susceptible to manipulation and unlikely to receive protection from other adults who might recognize and oppose such exploitation. The training facilities and equipment that would be necessary to safely prepare minors for dangerous crime-fighting activities should require specialized resources and expert supervision that would be impossible to provide without leaving evidence of their existence and creating professional relationships with individuals who possess relevant expertise in child development and safety training. The long-term psychological studies that should examine the effects of childhood exposure to violence and trauma in the context of vigilante activities would provide valuable insights into child development and resilience. Yet no such research appears to exist, despite the obvious scientific and social value of understanding how these experiences affect long-term adjustment and mental health. The alternative approaches to addressing the underlying issues that create young people willing to accept such dangerous roles, including improved foster care systems, grief counseling, and social support services, should provide more effective and less harmful methods for helping traumatized children recover and develop into healthy adults without requiring their participation in activities that expose them to additional danger and trauma. In examining these myriad ethical violations and logical impossibilities that surround Batman's use of child partners, we discover that the Robin concept serves not realistic mentorship purposes, but rather the narrative requirements of heroic storytelling that must provide emotional stakes and interpersonal relationships, while ignoring the practical and moral implications of exposing minors to extraordinary danger. The systematic exploitation of vulnerable children reflects not thoughtful character development, but rather the mythological logic that governs superhero narratives, where adult responsibilities yield to dramatic necessity and child welfare becomes subordinate to the eternal requirements of adventure and conflict that define the superhero genre, creating a fictional framework where the unthinkable becomes acceptable through collective agreement to ignore obvious moral contradictions in favor of entertaining stories that would be recognized as horrific child abuse if they occurred. In reality, in the vast network of heroic alliances that spans the globe and extends beyond the boundaries of Earth itself, where coordination between individuals possessing godlike powers should theoretically enable unprecedented efficiency in addressing threats that endanger all of humanity, there exists instead a pattern of communication failures and coordination breakdowns, so systematic and comprehensive that they transform what should be the most effective crisis response organization in history into a collection of isolated individuals whose inability to work together effectively creates more problems than it solves. This organizational catastrophe represents perhaps the most strategically bewildering aspect of the Justice League's operations, a series of logistical impossibilities and tactical failures that would render any real-world emergency response system completely ineffective, while creating coordination paradoxes that no amount of advanced technology or superhuman capabilities could adequately resolve. The most immediately apparent manifestation of these coordination failures lies in Batman's inexplicable reluctance to request assistance from teammates whose capabilities would make resolution of Gotham's problems trivial, as situations that pose genuine threats to entire city populations somehow remain localized conflicts that Batman handles alone despite the obvious availability of allies whose intervention would prevent massive casualties and property damage. The presence of Superman within communication range should make any street-level criminal activity in Gotham a temporary inconvenience rather than an ongoing crisis. Yet somehow the Man of Steel remains perpetually occupied with other matters during precisely those moments when his assistance would be most valuable and appropriate. The communication systems that supposedly connect Justice League members operate with selective effectiveness that appears to correlate more closely with dramatic necessity than with technological reliability or logical priority. Protocols, as urgent distress signals somehow fail to reach appropriate responders while less critical information travels instantly across global distances. The failure of these advanced communication networks during genuine emergencies suggests either fundamental design flaws that would be immediately apparent during basic testing procedures or deliberate filtering mechanisms that prevent team members from responding to calls for assistance that would interfere with individual character development and story arcs. The response time calculations that should govern Justice League deployment decisions create mathematical impossibilities when considered against the actual capabilities of team members and the global scope of their supposed responsibilities. As heroes who can travel at faster than light speeds or teleport across dimensional boundaries, somehow require extended periods to reach crisis locations that should be accessible within minutes or seconds of receiving emergency notifications. The failure to arrive promptly at disaster sites suggests either remarkable inefficiency in deployment procedures or artificial delays that serve narrative purposes, rather than reflecting realistic tactical considerations. The threat assessment protocols that determine which Justice League members respond to particular emergencies demonstrate inconsistent application of logical resource allocation principles, as world-ending crises occasionally receive minimal attention while relatively minor incidents somehow warrant full team mobilization. The assignment of heroes whose capabilities are inappropriate for specific threats suggests either systematic failure in threat analysis or decision-making processes that prioritize factors other than mission effectiveness and public safety outcomes. The intelligence sharing mechanisms that should enable coordinated response strategies appear to operate sporadically and selectively, as critical information about enemy capabilities, tactical approaches, and operational vulnerabilities frequently fails to reach team members who could most effectively utilize such knowledge. Batman's extensive files on superhuman threats and criminal organizations should theoretically provide the Justice League with comprehensive intelligence advantages, yet somehow this information remains compartmentalized in ways that prevent effective team coordination and strategic planning. The jurisdictional boundaries and territorial considerations that seem to govern Justice League operations create artificial limitations that prevent optimal deployment of resources and capabilities, as individual heroes appear to maintain exclusive responsibility for specific geographic regions, despite the obvious benefits of flexible assignment based on threat characteristics and available assets. Superman's apparent limitation to metropolis area incidents and Batman's focus on Gotham create resource allocation inefficiencies that should be immediately apparent to any competent strategic planner. The backup and redundancy systems that should ensure continuous availability of Justice League response capabilities appear to be either inadequate or non-existent, as critical team members regularly become unavailable through injury, off-world missions, or personal crises without apparent provision for alternative coverage of their essential functions. The failure to maintain operational continuity despite predictable personnel unavailability suggests either remarkable short-sightedness in organizational planning or deliberate acceptance of coverage gaps that compromise public safety. The training and coordination exercises that should be routine requirements for any effective team operation appear to occur infrequently or not at all, as Justice League members often display unfamiliarity with each other's capabilities and tactical approaches during joint operations that should benefit from extensive prior coordination and practice. The lack of standardized communication protocols, tactical coordination procedures, and emergency response sequences suggests either amateur-level organizational development or deliberate avoidance of systematic team-building activities. The command structure and decision-making authority that should govern Justice League operations during complex multi-hero missions remains unclear and apparently varies according to circumstances rather than following established protocols that would ensure efficient coordination and clear accountability. The absence of clear leadership hierarchies and operational authority creates potential for confusion and conflict during crisis situations, where rapid decision-making and coordinated action are essential for successful outcomes. The resource sharing and logistical support systems that should enable Justice League members to operate more effectively through pooled assets and capabilities appear to be either underdeveloped or entirely absent, as individual heroes regularly struggle with problems that could be easily resolved through access to technologies, information, or expertise available within the team, but somehow not shared or coordinated effectively. The strategic planning processes that should enable the Justice League to anticipate threats and prepare coordinated responses appear to be reactive rather than proactive, as the team consistently responds to crises after they develop, rather than identifying and addressing potential problems before they escalate to emergency levels. The failure to employ predictive analysis and preventive intervention suggests either limited analytical capabilities or organizational cultures that prioritize dramatic intervention over effective prevention. The international coordination requirements that should govern Justice League operations across national boundaries create diplomatic and legal complications that are never adequately addressed or resolved, as superhero interventions in foreign territories should require extensive governmental cooperation and legal frameworks that would be impossible to negotiate and maintain without creating significant political complications and bureaucratic oversight. The accountability and oversight mechanisms that should govern an organization wielding such enormous power and influence appear to be either minimal or entirely absent, as Justice League actions apparently occur without meaningful review or evaluation by external authorities who should reasonably demand transparency and accountability from individuals whose decisions affect global security and international stability. The funding and administrative support that should be necessary to maintain Justice League operations and facilities require financial resources and institutional relationships that should be visible to governmental oversight and public accountability. Yet the organization somehow operates without apparent budgetary constraints or administrative supervision that would be mandatory for any legitimate international emergency response organization. The research and development capabilities that should enable the Justice League to continuously improve their effectiveness through technological advancement and tactical innovation appear to be either underutilized or entirely absent, as the team's methods and capabilities remain essentially static, despite access to technologies and expertise that should enable dramatic improvements in operational effectiveness. The psychological and medical support services that should be routine requirements for individuals engaging in high-stress emergency response activities appear to be either inadequate or non-existent, as Justice League members regularly experience trauma, injury, and psychological stress without apparent access to specialized care and support services that would be standard requirements in any professional emergency response organization. The continuity planning and succession preparation that should ensure organizational survival despite personnel changes appear to be either minimal or entirely absent, as the departure or incapacitation of key team members creates operational gaps and capability losses that should be prevented through comprehensive planning and cross-training programs. The quality assurance and performance evaluation systems that should enable continuous improvement in Justice League operations appear to be either ineffective or entirely absent, as tactical failures and operational shortcomings are rarely analyzed or addressed through systematic organizational learning and adaptation processes that would be standard practices in any effective emergency response organization. The public relations and community engagement activities that should maintain popular support and governmental cooperation for Justice League operations appear to be either minimal or counterproductive, as the organization's relationship with civilian populations and governmental authorities often appears strained or adversarial, despite the obvious benefits of maintaining positive public relationships and institutional cooperation. In examining these myriad coordination failures and organizational impossibilities that characterize Justice League operations, we discover that the systematic inefficiency serves not realistic emergency response purposes, but rather the narrative requirements of superhero storytelling that must maintain individual character focus while creating artificial obstacles to easy problem resolution. The communication failures and coordination breakdowns reflect not plausible organizational dysfunction, but rather the fundamental challenge of maintaining dramatic tension in stories featuring characters whose combined capabilities should make most threats trivial to resolve, creating a fictional framework where operational efficiency yields to storytelling necessity and logical coordination becomes subordinate to the eternal requirements of individual heroic adventure that define the superhero genre. In the shadowed chambers where Gotham's most brilliant criminal minds conceive their elaborate schemes of conquest and revenge, there exists a pattern of strategic self-sabotage, so systematic and counterproductive that it transforms what should be unstoppable plans executed by superior intellects into Byzantine puzzles designed more for their own aesthetic satisfaction than for achieving practical objectives. This phenomenon of villainous incompetence represents perhaps the most psychologically bewildering aspect of Batman's rogues gallery, a collection of tactical failures and strategic miscalculations that would render any real criminal organization completely ineffective, while creating logical paradoxes that suggest either fundamental mental illness or deliberate self-destruction masquerading as criminal ambition. The most emblematic example of this self-defeating behavior lies in the Joker's consistently counterproductive approach to criminal planning, as his schemes invariably incorporate elements that serve no practical purpose, beyond alerting Batman to his activities and providing the hero with exactly the information necessary to thwart whatever destructive goals the Clown Prince of Crime claims to be pursuing. The elaborate death traps, cryptic clues, and theatrical presentations that characterize his criminal activities require extensive planning and resource allocation that could be far more effectively employed in straightforward attacks that would accomplish his stated objectives, without providing his enemies with opportunities for intervention and escape. The mathematical impossibility becomes even more pronounced when we consider the Joker's demonstrated survival rate, despite engaging in activities that should logically result in his death or permanent incapacitation, as his reckless disregard for personal safety combined with his preference for elaborate schemes creates compound probability calculations that should make his continued existence statistically impossible. The frequency with which he places himself in situations where capture or death appear inevitable, yet somehow manages to escape through coincidence or oversight, suggests either supernatural luck or fundamental misunderstanding of risk assessment that would prevent any rational individual from achieving his level of criminal longevity. The resource acquisition and logistical coordination required to execute the Joker's typically elaborate schemes should demand organizational capabilities and financial resources that exceed those available to most legitimate businesses. Yet somehow he consistently manages to procure exotic materials, hire specialized personnel, and coordinate complex operations without apparent access to sustainable funding sources or reliable criminal networks. The failure of law enforcement agencies to trace these obvious financial and logistical patterns suggests either remarkable investigative incompetence or the operation of supply chains that exist outside normal economic frameworks. The Riddler's approach to criminal activity presents even more glaring examples of self-sabotage disguised as intellectual superiority, as his compulsive need to provide clues about his intended crimes transforms what should be undetectable criminal activities into elaborate puzzle games that essentially guarantee his eventual capture and defeat. The psychological compulsion that drives him to announce his plans through riddles and wordplay represents a form of criminal behavior so fundamentally counterproductive that it suggests either severe mental illness or deliberate desire for failure masked as intellectual challenge. The complexity and sophistication of the Riddler's puzzles demonstrate remarkable intelligence and creative capability that could be applied to legitimate endeavors with far greater potential for personal satisfaction and financial reward. Yet he consistently chooses to employ these talents in ways that actively undermine his own criminal objectives. The time and effort required to construct elaborate riddles and implement corresponding criminal schemes could accomplish far more through legal applications of the same intellectual resources, suggesting either remarkable inability to recognize opportunity costs or deliberate preference for failure over success. The pattern of providing Batman with precisely the information necessary to solve his crimes suggests either unconscious desire to be caught and stopped or conscious collaboration with law enforcement objectives that would make him an unwitting ally rather than a genuine enemy. The alternative explanation, that his criminal activities represent elaborate forms of entertainment or intellectual exercise, rather than serious attempts at illegal enrichment or social disruption, would transform his villain status into performance art that poses minimal, genuine threat to public safety. Two-Face's decision-making methodology represents perhaps the most strategically irrational approach to criminal planning ever documented, as his reliance on coin flips to determine crucial, tactical, and strategic choices effectively randomizes his criminal activities in ways that prevent coherent planning and eliminate any possibility of achieving consistent objectives. The surrender of decision-making authority to random chance transforms what should be carefully orchestrated criminal enterprises into chaotic sequences of arbitrary actions that serve no rational purpose and achieve no meaningful chaotic goals. The psychological implications of Two-Face's binary worldview and random decision-making process suggest cognitive limitations that should prevent effective criminal activity regardless of his underlying intelligence or resources, as the inability to engage in coherent planning and strategic thinking would make him vulnerable to even basic law enforcement techniques and investigative procedures. His documented legal background and prosecutorial experience should provide him with extensive knowledge of criminal justice procedures and investigative methods, yet he consistently fails to apply this expertise in ways that would improve his chances of avoiding capture. The theatrical elements that Two-Face incorporates into his criminal activities, including the elaborate staging, symbolic references, and thematic consistency that characterize his crimes, require planning and coordination that directly contradict his supposed reliance on random chance for decision-making. The contradiction between claiming to base decisions on coin flips while simultaneously executing complex schemes that require extensive advance preparation suggests either fundamental dishonesty about his decision-making process or psychological compartmentalization that would indicate severe mental illness. The Penguin's approach to criminal enterprises demonstrates a different category of strategic failure, as his preference for elaborate schemes and exotic weapons consistently leads him away from the straightforward racketeering and organized crime activities that should provide more reliable income and lower risk of superhero intervention. His documented business acumen and legitimate success in various commercial ventures should enable him to achieve far greater financial success through legal means. Yet he continues to pursue criminal activities that generate minimal profit while creating maximum exposure to law enforcement attention. The exotic weaponry, and elaborate gadgets that the Penguin employs in his criminal schemes require development costs and manufacturing expenses that should far exceed any reasonable return on investment from typical criminal activities, suggesting either access to unlimited financial resources or remarkably poor understanding of basic economic principles. The umbrellas, modified with various weapon systems and technological enhancements, represent engineering achievements that could generate substantial legitimate profits if commercialized appropriately. Yet these innovations remain exclusively applied to criminal purposes that provide minimal financial benefit. The social pretensions and status-seeking behavior that motivate many of the Penguin's criminal activities suggest underlying psychological needs that could be satisfied more effectively through legitimate social and philanthropic activities that would enhance his reputation while avoiding legal consequences and superhero intervention. His desire for respect and recognition from Gotham's social elite could be achieved through conventional means that would provide greater satisfaction while eliminating the risks associated with criminal activity. Scarecrow's focus on fear-based experiments and psychological terrorism represents another category of counterproductive criminal behavior, as his scientific interest in studying fear responses could be pursued more effectively through legitimate research that would provide better experimental controls, more reliable data, and opportunities for publication and professional recognition that criminal activities cannot offer. His documented background in psychology and psychiatry should enable him to achieve significant academic and professional success without resorting to illegal experimentation that compromises the validity of his research while exposing him to criminal prosecution. The fear toxins and psychological warfare techniques that Scarecrow develops demonstrate remarkable expertise in biochemistry and neuroscience that could generate substantial commercial and medical applications if applied to legitimate pharmaceutical research and development. The failure to pursue patent protection and commercialization opportunities for such breakthrough technologies suggests either remarkable lack of business acumen or deliberate preference for criminal application over legitimate profit and professional recognition. The experimental protocols that Scarecrow employs in his fear research violate fundamental principles of scientific methodology and ethical research practices in ways that would invalidate any data collected and prevent meaningful analysis of results, suggesting either severe gaps in his scientific education or deliberate abandonment of professional standards that would be necessary for legitimate research contributions. The elaborate themed death traps and escape scenarios that various Batman villains construct for capturing and eliminating their nemesis represent perhaps the most obvious examples of self-defeating behavior, as these complex mechanisms invariably incorporate design flaws and escape opportunities that enable Batman to survive and defeat their creators. The engineering expertise and financial resources required to construct such elaborate devices could accomplish their lethal objectives far more efficiently through straightforward methods that would eliminate the possibility of escape or rescue. The psychological satisfaction that villains apparently derive from creating elaborate death scenarios suggests either sadistic personality disorders that prevent rational goal-oriented behavior or unconscious desires to be defeated and stopped that override their conscious criminal objectives. The failure to employ simple and effective elimination methods when they clearly possess the capability and opportunity to do so indicates either remarkable strategic incompetence or deliberate self-sabotage that serves psychological needs more important than criminal success. The tendency to explain their schemes and motivations to Batman before attempting to eliminate him represents a universal pattern of self-defeating behavior that provides their intended victim with crucial information necessary for escape and counteraction. Yet somehow this strategic error is repeated consistently by different criminals who should logically learn from previous failures and adopt more effective approaches. The timing mechanisms and delayed activation systems that characterize most villain death traps serve no practical purpose beyond providing opportunities for rescue and intervention, as immediate execution would be more reliable and eliminate the possibility of outside assistance or unexpected complications. The incorporation of such obvious vulnerabilities into otherwise sophisticated elimination devices suggests either remarkable oversight in planning or deliberate introduction of escape possibilities that contradict stated objectives. The criminal organizations and henchman recruitment that support major villain operations demonstrate systematic failures in personnel management and operational security that should make large-scale criminal enterprises impossible to maintain, as the loyalty and competence problems that plague most villain organizations would prevent effective coordination and create constant security breaches that would expose operations to law enforcement investigation. The hiring practices and employee management approaches employed by major villains suggest either remarkable inability to assess character and competence, or deliberate recruitment of individuals whose limitations guarantee operational failures and security breaches. The failure to implement basic operational security measures and loyalty verification procedures indicates either amateur-level criminal management or systematic infiltration that should be immediately apparent to anyone with experience in clandestine operations. In examining these myriad examples of self-defeating behavior and strategic incompetence that characterize Batman villain activities, we discover that the counterproductive nature of their schemes serves not realistic criminal purposes, but rather the narrative requirements of heroic storytelling that must provide Batman with opportunities for detection, intervention, and victory, despite facing opponents whose intelligence and resources should make defeat impossible. The systematic failures in villainous planning reflect not plausible criminal incompetence, but rather the fundamental challenge of creating threatening enemies who must ultimately be defeatable by heroic intervention, resulting in a fictional framework where criminal genius yields to narrative necessity and logical strategy becomes subordinate to the eternal requirements of heroic triumph over evil that define the superhero genre. And so we conclude our examination of the paradoxes that inhabit Batman's world. These curious contradictions that arise not from poor storytelling but from the fundamental challenge of maintaining a living mythology across decades of creators and changing times. Each plot hole we have explored tonight speaks to the deeper truth about legendary figures. They exist not bound by the constraints of mundane logic, but elevated to realms where consistency matters less than the eternal themes they represent. Batman's inconsistencies are not flaws to be corrected, but evidence of a character so vital, so essential to our understanding of heroism and justice, that he transcends the limitations of any single narrative framework. Rest now, explorer of fictional mysteries, knowing that these contradictions are not obstacles to belief, but invitations to wonder, not problems to solve, but puzzles to ponder, as we drift into dreams where logic yields to legend, and where the impossible becomes inevitable in the shadows of our sleeping minds.